So we're going straight into the next event. We have some very snazzy graphics onto the stage. Can I have a round of applause? Thank you. Kojo Karam and Kovie Biakolo. And you're going to see how brilliant
welcome. Is this on? Yes, it is. Welcome, Howard and Kojo.
Thank you.
We're going to get straight into it in terms of both of your books, but if you want to go ahead and just say the title of your books really quickly. Go ahead.
Well, I'll start. First of all, thank you to everyone at Ake for having me. It's wonderful to be in Nigeria. You know, I'm a Ghana boy, so I know the area, but I've never been in Nigeria myself. My book, what I'm going to be talking about today, is called Uncommon Wealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire, and I think it might have a lot of resonances with Howard's work as well.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. My book is Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. And I will have time to talk about it, but I have to say how deeply I appreciate everything that Lola has done for these last 10 years. And what a pleasure it is to be back here for this event. It has meant so much to me to return here and to be back in Nigeria and in Lagos specifically. I consider, and my book gets into this specific geography to be the fountainhead of the modern world and of the Atlantic world, and the platform on which, or from which, everything that we take for granted and know and experience was built. And so I'm honored to be here among you, and I am so proud of Lola and of everything, really, that she has done in these last 10 years. It's beyond description. Thank you.
All right, so both of your books are ultimately making arguments that the modern world and modern civilization as we know it, in terms of economic success, experience in the West at large, and in your case, Kojo, in Britain specifically, were shaped by Africa and at cost to Africans. How does this legacy manifest in economic and social cultural ways between Europe and the continent today?
Well, I'll start with that. Thank you very much for that question. I think I will introduce kind of two concepts to really show how this idea of what happened in West Africa and Britain's colonies more broadly impacts on even economics in Britain today, to try and make my argument a little bit clearer. And that's two different concepts. One, the concept of development, something that we've heard a lot of, and then the newer concept that I try and explore in the book, this idea of the boomerang. Now, I think a lot of people here might have grown up in between Africa and Europe, or Africa and North America, and will be familiar with the problem of trying to rationalize the differences between the socioeconomic and political context that you might have been experiencing growing up. I know that that was my experience growing up between Ghana and Britain, and the explanation that I was often given for the difference that you might see in healthcare, in education, in wealth between Ghana and Britain was the idea of Ghana being a developing country and Britain being a developed country. This idea of development, this one-way movement of history, and the promise that, well, as long as countries like Ghana and Nigeria or Bangladesh or Singapore, followed the rules, ate their vegetables, said their prayers, and did everything that the IMF and the World Bank told them to, eventually they would have economies very similar to places like Britain and America. And I think looking at the world in 2022, we can see that that movement of developing into developed isn't something that's manifested. This category of developing is kind of like, the waiting hall of purgatory. You're always developing, you're never quite developed. But instead, what we started to see is a lot of the dynamics and a lot of the trend used to be seen as the preserve of the developed chaos of the Liz Truss government. There's a lot of WhatsApp group chat amongst Ghanaians saying that, Britain got a Ghanaian chancellor, and all of a sudden the British economy started looking like Ghana in the 1980s. We started to have the bond market devaluation. You wanted to have escalating wealth inequality and huge insecurity of people's living standards, a fall in everyday, in the possibility of people being able to meet their living standards. Perhaps a clear manifestation is the discussion of potential electronic rolling blackouts over Britain over winter. So, we're getting dumso, for those Ghanaians in the audience, light off in Britain maybe. Why is that happening? Why are we having this reverse dynamic of development? This is what I really try and talk about in Uncommonwealth. And I think that rather than explain the difference between the colonies and Britain through development, I would use this idea of the boomerang. And this is a concept that was really developed by the Marshall colonies, does not simply stay in those colonies, but eventually ricochets and boomerangs back into Europe itself. Now, Césaire was talking about the kind of colonial violence of Italy and Germany in places like Namibia and Abyssinia, influencing the rise of European fascism, additional loan agreements, all of these economic violences that impacted socialization of the economy, for the privatization of the economy that even people in Britain are wrestling with even up until 2022. And I try and use a set of examples looking at actions that happened in decolonization, from the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah to the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Iran, and show how that impacts how often the very same companies, we talk about the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company like there's some distant, so there you can already see that continuum of what, I can talk about that more a little bit later.
Howard?
Thank you. I would, Kojo said, but I think the story, as the subtitle of my book suggests, really begins far earlier. And a central argument of my book is that the wealth of the West, and more specifically the divergence of the West in terms of economic development and of prosperity, was predicated first and foremost on exploitation of Africa and of Africans, and that this begins in the 15th century, and that we have been taught a story about that period in time that is radically different from the reality. The story that we tend to have been taught is that the Europeans were helping greater wealth for themselves, and that they envisioned Africa simply as, or understood Africa simply as, a geographic obstacle that needed to be circumnavigated. And in that manner, Africa is entirely cut out of the narrative of the creation of the modern world. Instead, we get in the conventional historical accounts a presentation of this thing called the Age of Exploration, which delivers to us a cast of great navigators who finally do reach Asia, and then, at roughly the same time, also more or less by happenstance, reach the so-called New World. But Africa doesn't appear anywhere in the story, really, when in fact, the reality is that beginning in the early decades of the 15th century, the Portuguese, being a relatively new kingdom in Europe, the Aviz dynasty specifically, and a very poor and fragile kingdom, set as their mission connecting with Africa for the purposes of wealth acquisition. And the reason they did this was because in the previous century, meaning the early 14th century, they came to understand enough about African history and African wealth to tell them that this was the key. And this begins in Mali, in the Malian Empire, with an emperor in the opening years of the 14th century named Abu Bakr II, who launched two efforts to cross the Atlantic. Some of you may never have heard this. You may think this is science fiction or fantasy or some kind of Afrocentric kind of view of history. This is very well documented. Contemporaneous accounts written by the scribes of the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt, when after Abu Bakr II dies in the or disappears in the second of these attempts to cross the Atlantic. His successor, a person that many of you will have heard of, Mansa Musa, then makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, and stops on the way in Cairo and distributes 18 tons of pure gold. Mali was a gold superpower in this age. It was the major source of gold in what for the Europeans was then the known world. And this depresses the price of gold for at least a decade. Gold becomes less than a tenth the value of silver, which is reverse of the normal historical ratio. And the Portuguese, not having a window onto the Mediterranean Sea as the Spanish and the Italians and the other southern Europeans did, said, we've got to find a way to connect with this African empire. And so this is the spark of the beginning of the modern era, and quite the contrary, to the contrary of the myth of the age of discovery that we're taught, which is all centered on Asia, under the auspices of Henry the Navigator, a prince in the Aviz dynasty. The Portuguese launch a multi-decade effort to explore Africa and to develop economic, and this may surprise you, political and diplomatic relations with African polities in the 15th century. This culminates in 1471 with their arrival in what is now present-day Ghana and the discovery of extraordinary wealth in gold at the port of Elmina, which I posit as the sort of departure point for the modern age. It is not the discovery of the Americas. It is not the discovery of a route to India and to China via the sea, and it is not about circumnavigating Africa. So where this connects with Kojo's narrative is that if one takes up this metaphor of the boomerang, I think that you can understand the history of these last centuries as a period in which the West was launched and then was able to coast on the backs of imperial relations that were developed with the so-called Third World, but which started and which persisted for the longest period of time in Africa. And because of the extraction of human resources, meaning via the enslavement of Africans, the invention of chattel slavery as an institution, the development of sugar as a history-changing process. Sugar, I can tell you, you ask me a question about the modern world and I can relate it to sugar. Sugar, which is surprisingly the origin of democracy in Europe. Europe has been coasting on the backs of these things for all of these years, and finally they have lost the momentum that these events created, and this is when the boomerang takes place. Just to close the buckle, because I've made some big claims here, so you don't think I'm just, talking, right? So, coffee and sugar become commonly available products in England in the 17th century. In 1650, the first coffee shop, these are both slave-grown products, the first coffee shop is opened in Oxford. Whoever the clever entrepreneur is who put coffee and sugar together lit the world on fire. Coffee shops then spread incredibly quickly to London. And within the space of a decade or a little bit more, there were coffee shops everywhere in London. And people, what happened is that, as one might imagine, people linger at coffee shops. Look at a Starbucks today. People sit around in coffee shops. They are alert. English people, like other Europeans, didn't have reliably safe sources of water to drink because of hygiene in that era. And so during the daytime, Europeans, well, I'll speak to English, the French drank wine, English people drank ale, even at the workplace. And ale induces torpor, if not outright drunkenness. So now comes coffee and sugar, which are stimulants, and people are sitting around in coffee shops being stimulated and having lively conversations about the affairs of the day. This is the birth of the modern notion of citizenship in England, where people begin to take it as their right to know and to be able to discuss freely what is happening in Parliament, what is happening with the Crown, what is happening in terms of war, with taxation, with anything important in the day. And some other clever entrepreneur decides, well, so we have these captive audiences addicted to sugar and caffeine sitting in coffee shops. What if we could sell them a product that would tell them what's happening? This is the birth of the newspaper. All of this flows from connections with Africa, from exploitation of labor from Africa, from the invention of this terrible institution called chattel slavery, and from the plantation economies which grew out of it. And this is the rocket fuel that set Western Europe, specifically Atlantic-facing Western Europe, on a trajectory that for the first time in history lofted it above the great societies of Asia, notably China and India.
Well, there you go. So, Kojo, one argument that I thought was really stark in on Commonwealth was the notion that capitalism was born out of empire. If there is to be an end to the neocolonial empires that we are technically on this continent still in relationship with in terms of capital, what does that sort of future look like economically for many African nations who have adopted similar economic structures?
Brilliant. Really, really important, I think, challenging question to wrestle with. And I think one that connects to the deep history that Howard just mapped out for us. When I talk about this idea of capitalism, and even when I talk about this idea of Britain being born out of empire, out of the imperial project, I think it's often one of the more counterfactual claims that I make in On Commonwealth. But it's something that is just mapped out by the historical fact. We often say, and I might say even almost reflectively, this idea that Britain had an empire, France had an empire, Belgium had an empire, Britain had an empire, when it's much more accurate to say that the empire had Britain, as in the political and constitutional formation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain was very much born out of the imperial project. An example is that the constitutional relationship that Britain has with Barbados or with Jamaica predates the Acts of the Union, which actually unifies England and Scotland as a single constitutional state by decades. By the time we get the two main nations of Britain joining together legally, Britain already has colonies in the Caribbean through Barbados and Jamaica. It already has the Virginia slave colonies. It already has slave forts across West Africa in now modern-day Ghana. It's already a colonial entity before it unifies with Scotland, and the main driver behind that unification was the promise of imperial wealth that allowed the Scottish nobles to forsake colonization in now modern-day Panama with New Caledonia. And anyone who's read the great Scottish poets like Robert Burns understands that it was this promise of colonial gold that brought Britain together. And so with Britain, you then have this emergence of now modern-day capitalism, which Howard mentioned as being born out of the coffee houses of the 17th century, and that for the last few years there's been increasing conversation around the decolonization of the public space, you know, the decolonization of art galleries, the decolonization of street names, the decolonization of statues, you know, pulling down statues. And whilst this kind of cultural and symbolic representation of empire, I think, is important, you know, part of me wanted to scream almost like, we do know that the main purpose of empire wasn't like a global statue building project. Like, this wasn't what empire was about. It wasn't simply about cultural dominance. It wasn't even simply about the imposition of racial hierarchies across the world. All of those different elements were in the service of its core motivation, which was the material extraction of resources and the transfer of those resources over the world, the transfer of gold and oil and coffee and sugar across borders. This is what empire was about. It was a material project. And its relationship to capitalism is that what the British Empire, more than any of them, allowed for was an umbrella that meant that country, or companies more like, because the British Empire was so good at the use of private colonial companies, that's what made it the most successful empire of all time, whether that's the Hudson Bay Company in North America, Royal Africa Company, Royal Niger Company, East India Company, most famous of all. These companies could move resources from India. In the 20th century did, and this is the story that I kind of take on from Howard, is that it broke up that umbrella. It meant that now, rather than being under one sovereign umbrella, there were multiple different governments that could impose labor laws, tax restrictions, protectionist economic policy, the private capital legalments. All of these different tools were used to undercut the sovereignty of those new independent governments. And for me, there's some accountability.
As lawyers, as managers, and as other sorts of agents in the sugar domains of Jamaica, of Barbados, and various other places. They were not, in fact, the Scottish, were not, in fact, welcomed yet in England. English people did not want Scottish people in their midst. And so a Scottish elite might have asked, why should we join you in union? And the English answer was, because we'll let you get in on this empire game and you can rise too, just like we are. On capitalism, you know, just as the story has been mistold, and I don't believe this is an accident, that Africa was simply an obstacle and it was all about circumnavigation in order to get to Asia. The story of capitalism itself is mistold. The story of capitalism, we are urged to believe, is something that begins in the Lancashire region of England. Some ingenious people figure out new forms of labor organization. They put together these fancy devices called modern looms, all under one roof, and then suddenly you have a textile industry. This is not the beginning of capitalism. Capitalism begins in Barbados, in Jamaica, and various other places in Brazil and throughout the Caribbean, where for the first time in history, you have large numbers of people. And I'm talking about, because it's the first time in history, a scale far larger than anywhere in Europe at the time, working in one business, for one firm. And these firms, so to speak, were sugar plantations. And what made them specifically capitalist in organization were three things. Their scale, I've already spoken to the large numbers of people employed, the demand for specialized training and skills for very specifically different types of workers. So these are key attributes of capitalism. You have people working in highly trained specialties, and sometimes these highly trained specialty workers were in fact enslaved people. Often they were enslaved people. And the third piece of this was the importance of synchronicity. You can't produce sugar without exquisite care to timing and to sequence and making sure that various operations mesh precisely in terms of their execution. These are all things that we associate as bedrocks of capitalism. But the way the history of capitalism is taught to us is this doesn't actually begin for another couple of years, and it happens in England. And there's a reason for that, because you need to, if you are in the imperium, you need to have a story about how good things stem from your virtue, from your genius, from something special about you that elevates you over others. And to situate this story in slavery would be to undermine all of that. Just to finish on this particular point, so going back to Lancashire and the birth of textile industries in England, where do we think the raw materials for these textiles came from? They came from the Mississippi River Valley. More than 90% of the cotton that was used to fuel, so to speak, these mills in the Lancashire region came from Africans and the descendants of Africans put to work as chattel in the Mississippi River Valley. And so we are taught that the English people discovered or invented or innovated their way toward capitalism, and out of this story entirely is cut from this story the narrative of where the stuff came from in the first place. You don't get a textile mill without cotton, and the base of this cotton production was the enslavement of Africans.
Really quickly. Let's try this one. Really quickly on that point. In your book, Howard, you really sort of hone in on, how African bodies were controlled, were colonized, were enslaved, and that is central to how the economic world of the economic constructs of the last 500 years are built. And your book, however, stops at the Second World War. But an Afro-pessimist might say that this still continues despite the independence struggle. What would you have to say to that?
I'm delighted by this question. What I have to say about this is that the Ake Festival must continue because I have another book coming. And it picks up with the Second World War. And it picks up with decolonization. And it picks up with the argument that contrary to the narratives that we are encouraged to believe in the West, decolonization was the most important event of the 20th century. It was not the thing that Americans call the efforts of their greatest generation to fight fascism in Europe. It was not the heroism of the people of London as they're being bombed by the Nazis. I don't mean to say that people who lived those experiences have no reason to remember them or to be proud. But the big event of the century was the second emancipation that took place throughout the so-called Third World and whose heartland was Africa, where the greatest number of places were decolonized and where the basis of life was changed radically for extraordinarily large numbers of people for the second time in history, meaning the first time being the end of literal enslavement, and the second time being political enslavement. And so I consciously cut the book off. I've already covered 600 years in Born in Blackness, and publishers sort of groan if you want to make a book very much longer than that. And so the next book this was all conceived with an idea to continuing the story forward.
Can I just turn it? Here. It's like hot. It's like hot mic. Like one of them's going to work, and we just pass it around. Just to echo that point that Howard made, it's a key argument that I make in On Commonwealth as well. The idea of decolonization being the great event of the 20th century, beyond either of the world wars, beyond even the communist revolution in Russia. It is the transformation of the global map that is most significant in terms of how politics, economics, law would function for the rest of the 20th century. I argue that trying to even understand the 20th century without having a solid grasp on decolonization is almost like trying to understand the 17th or 18th centuries without understanding the American Revolution or the French Revolution. And yet, at least in the United Kingdom, which is, after all, the main character in so many of these decolonization struggles, it's usually, the antagonist in so many of these national independence stories around the world. This entire global transformation is almost entirely erased from the popular memory. At the time of the last Commonwealth Games, there was a YouGov poll that was ran, which asked random people in Britain to name Commonwealth countries, and it found that 1 in 5 British people couldn't name one Commonwealth country. Not one, not India, not Jamaica, not even Australia. None of them were aware of where the British Empire had been, when it ended, how it ended, what were the contests around its ending. Were some of them violent as they were in Cyprus and Kenya? Were some of them kind of jurisdictional like they were more in Ghana? All of these histories were ignored, and this isn't a kind of reflection on those people. It's a reflection of a system of amnesia that has been anchored into our educational and cultural memory in the United Kingdom, which I argue leaves us unable to understand how the modern world functions in 2022.
I usually do refer to that as historical amnesia, by the way. But I want to sort of move along into, in everyday African life, across countries, perhaps away from some of these specific histories that are miscast or even hidden for Africans in terms of the understanding of ourselves. In terms of nation states, there exists an idea that we put too much emphasis on European domination of Africa today. And because perhaps of the lack of progress politically, economically, social, culturally in our own nation states and our own disappointments with that, we sort of look to our own forms of government as having the responsibility. So how do you weigh that sort of colonial and enslavement history and the responsibility of that against sort of the political realities that we deal with on the continent?
Thank you. I want to just say just something very quickly about the last question, and I'll come right to this. I want to quote or paraphrase Aimé Césaire again, the great Martinican thinker of the last century, who said that Europeans were fine with fascism as long as it was operated on non-Europeans. And when fascism became or targeted Europeans, then fighting it became a great cause. This, I think, is a very productive way of thinking of the 20th century and thinking why the Second World War was not the great event of the century, and that decolonization, as I said, and I think as Kojo agrees, was. On your question, Kovia, I'm not one of these people who thinks it is productive to raise colonization as the answer to every ill in Africa. But I'm also not one of these people who thinks, as one so often hears, that colonization and the enslavement over a period of centuries of Africans is of no consequence in understanding Africa's present condition, right? I believe that honesty compels us to understand that the world economy has certain structures to it, and that these structures are, in fact, unequal by design and inimical to the entry of new powers into the fray, and that this has happened purposely over a period of time. This is the afterlife of imperialism that Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism. I don't believe Kwame Nkrumah was ill-inspired in coming up with this conception. Let me say something about the longer-term nature of what Africa is dealing with, though. It is commonly observed that Africa or Africans did not, with very few exceptions, design the contours of their countries. They did not map out 54 countries and call it the map of Africa. This was done to them. And to people who would like to sustain this view that Africans have been independent for a very long time, why are they still making excuses about things that happened in the past? What is the very long time? Africa was colonized still in my lifetime. I don't know how old the average age of the audience is, but I don't consider yet my own lifespan to be particularly long in historical terms, right? In fact, let me take this home to my country. Africans, or the descendants of Africans in my own country, were subjected to a kind of internal colonization and legal inequality, legalized inequality in my lifetime. These are not matters of distant history. These are recent events. These are facts that date from a mere yesterday, metaphorically speaking, in terms of the span of time. So how is Africa going to emerge into a better future, I think, is the part of the premise of your question. And I think part of the answer is, again, Kwame Nkrumah understood this he understood the problem without having devised a solution. Having 54 countries is not a good recipe for success. Having lots of Togos, I don't mean to pick on any particular country, or Malawis, or Swazilands, or even Ghana is a relatively small country, is not a formula that favors the emergence of a strong nation state. You don't have the size of market, you don't have a population base that can serve as a form of leverage in terms of attracting industry or being a platform for the birth of strong companies and the like. This is a fundamental problem for Africa. I believe last time I looked at this, there are at least 17 African countries that are totally landlocked. What are landlocked countries supposed to do? They were created that way, and they must live with it now. Being a landlocked country, I've read in certain economic scholarship, is like having a 20% tax on your GDP every year. So that's like a surtax of 20. We're not talking about the higher risk of violence which exists for landlocked countries, conflict with your neighbors with landlocked countries, because landlocked countries on average have many more neighbors. Countries that have a seafront have the sea as their neighbor, right? 20% of your income or of your wealth taken away every year simply by the virtue of the borders that you have, right? How are Africans going to deal with this? Well, as I said in a talk at a separate event yesterday here in Nigeria, Africans have been wrestling with this from the very beginning, and there's no obvious or easy solution. Kwame Nkrumah wanted to figure out how to draw countries together, and with the idea of surrendering a degree of sovereignty to a greater whole. And this didn't work on the continental level, obviously. It produced the OAU, which became really a club of incumbents, basically. He created sub-regional organizations of several different types, a union with Guinea and Mali, two French-speaking countries, neither of which has a border with Ghana. He was exhausting every degree of ingenuity and investing Ghana's resources in trying to make this happen. But once the germ of the nation state, as drawn up in Berlin, was planted, it became incredibly hard to deracinate or to uproot. And Nigeria tried. Nigeria, in the 1960s, underwent a civil war. That was about how do we get out of this formula and try to figure out for ourselves something that feels like it fits better. I don't think probably not any, I don't think most Nigerians, I'm not here to speak for Nigerians, but I don't imagine most Nigerians think that a civil war is a good recipe for getting out of this. So what is the way? This is a tremendous predicament that Africa faces, and it is the fruit of imperialism. That doesn't mean that African governments can be expected to be relieved of any responsibility for performance, or for effort, or for rigor, or for the defense and promotion of what they can best devise as a sense of the true national interest. And many, perhaps most African countries might be judged to be failing on that basis. But the fundamental issues that underlie the realities of the African nation state derive from a previous era and are chained to the lives of African countries like a leg iron today, and no one yet has figured a way out.
On the same question, I think what I'll try and do is to just reflect on this idea of what do we mean by colonization and the legacies of colonization, because I don't think it's as simple as simply saying if we connect problems that exist within the African continent today to legacies of colonization, that we're blaming Europeans for everything. That, oh, this is just the Europeans again, and this isn't being manifested and perpetuated and repurposed with native kind of hands on the instruments of statecraft. That can still be legacies of colonization, even if there's not a European to be seen for miles. I don't think there's anybody who's spent time in a Ghanaian visa office or a Nigerian visa office who might feel that, yeah, we can blame ourselves for some of our problems. This isn't all simply Europeans. But what we are talking about with colonization, as Howard mentioned, is the over 400-year legacy of framing the rules that govern the modern world. And the rules that govern the modern world, particularly when we think about the African continent, have a real concern with the tension between the interests of global capitalism and the potential disruptive power of popular democracy. To kind of draw upon a protege of Aimé Césaire, who we've mentioned a lot over the course of this talk, the other great Martinican political theorist of the 20th century, Frantz Fanon, we can often see the problem that African states faced after independence as having to navigate the pitfalls of national bourgeoisie, the pitfalls of what happens when local elites take on the instruments of statecraft and are faced with that same problem of having to govern a jurisdiction that was framed in order to facilitate the transfer of resources simply to the global market, not about the cultivation and development of strong institutions, but to allow for this kind of particularly extractive form of capitalism. Now that influences the type of governments that emerge or type of governments that are allowed to emerge in these particular jurisdictions. The kind of rise of authoritarian governments that we saw on the African continent, in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, isn't because, Africans have this kind of innate desire for a strong leader, all these kind of, quasi-eugenicist explanations that were often given in the British press. Well, they're uncivilized people, they just need a strong chief to kind of crack down upon them. No, this is because that is the most effective way of minimizing popular dissent in order to allow a very extractive form of capitalism to continue to develop unencumbered. And this is part of the reasons why we're starting to see, again, using this idea of the boomerang, kind of mechanisms and forms of democracy-limiting government now starting to manifest in the former heart of the imperial world, the former global north. This rise of, kind of authoritarian nativist strongmen that we're seeing not just in Brazil or India, but now with a Boris Johnson in Britain or a Donald Trump in America. How many comedians and writers talked about how Donald Trump reminded them, of an African president, reminded them of, and any of the kind of great strongmen of the 20th century. the reason why we have that, or why the kind of, the Capitol Hill riot reminded you of this undercutting of the legitimacy of democracy and elections, though used to be seen as the preserve of the backward nations of the world. Oh, it's only in Africa they can't accept democratic elections and will try and storm the government to overthrow them. Instead, we're starting to see those forms of statecraft emerge in the West because, I argue, we're starting to see the type of extractive capitalism that was really cultivated and sharpened on the African continent now being applied all across the world. I think that, following from a lot of Howard's argument, I think that even in the 20th century, we can see the African continent being used almost like a laboratory of capitalism to test out ways in which we can have wealth extraction whilst devastating the lives of everyday people in those countries. And now that's been practiced on the African continent, we see it being used and applied, perhaps not to the same intensity and with the same levels of violence, but with a definite echo of those dynamics, even in places like the United Kingdom and the United States up until 2022. And so for me, it's a real reversal of this idea of development if we want to understand what's happening to states all across the world. We can see what happened in the African continent as happening first and worse there, but it is coming for all of us, no matter where we might have a passport. So yeah, those precious red passports that a lot of us British people have might not be the protection from economic violence that we think it will be.
That's not supposed to be a joke. It sounds like one, but it's not supposed to be a joke. This will probably be the final question, but I wanted to, we've talked a lot about capitalism, and when it comes to the African continent, your books ultimately both talk about racial capitalization, racial capital. And in this continent, certainly in this particular country, which I'm from, not true of all African states, but there is a tendency to sort of de-racialize ourselves, even when we are racialized by others, and particularly, obviously, Europeans. And because of that, I think that because of that deracialization, the argument for that is that European constructs of race are imposed on us. To that point, can African states move forward with their own frameworks rather than the ones that are imposed on them by a racial capital? And I'm sure the audience would like a little bit of hope in your answers. Hope.
Before I come to the hope, I want to say again something about the last question, and that is thinking about this blame question, right? So how much responsibility is due to Europeans? How much is inherent to Africans and the management of their own affairs, right? The 1960s are the decade to look at for this. And to the people who say that was a long time ago and that it's time for Africans to stop making excuses, I don't believe I'm making excuses, but I'm responding to that type of argumentation, right? If you look at the history of the 1960s, what you will see is that these newborn African states and their leaders attempted an astounding variety of different approaches to creating a new basis for life in their countries. Kwame Nkrumah, who we've talked about, sought a solution in Pan-Africanism with a socialist tinge. Right next door to him, Houphouët-Boigny created a model of state capitalism. Across the continent in Tanzania, you get a model of African socialism. I can cite more examples. There is an astonishing variety of attempts to innovate and to create viable systems and dispensations to provide for security and prosperity in the lives of Africans. And none of them can be judged to have succeeded in the long term. And so the question I put to you and to the doubters is this due to an inherent thing about Africans? Is there a bad governance gene in Africans, or some kind of lack of intelligence in Africans, or something about, some pathology that is inherent to Africans? Or is the failure of all of these various attempts to innovate and to create solutions for these newly created states more about, or mostly about, a systemic hostility to the emergence of the grand geopolitical space called Africa into the global economy and political sphere in the 20th century. And I believe that the latter has vastly more to do with the problem than anything that you can cite as a common trait in terms of the personalities or the qualities of Africans as people, right? So, the hope for the future. I do not believe that anyone sitting here today needs to have a complex about themselves as a human being. Hopefully, you don't need to hear that, right? But Nigeria has an answer, as haphazard as it may seem sometimes, to your question. There will be 850 million Nigerians before too long, right? And when there are 850 million Nigerians, who will tell them that you are
I have to stop you. That's a lot of us. That's a whole lot of us.
We're on that path, right? And there are many challenges that this raises, but there is a lot of potential also that this raises. And I believe in that potential. And I believe that these demographics will do something that no African regime has succeeded in doing up until now, and that is refashioning the political map of Africa. That the current setup of the nation state is going to melt under the pressure of African demographics, and that this is going to force the birth of new arrangements that offer much more possibility for Africans. I've just written, just in the last few weeks, an article that appeared in the Guardian long read section that talks about a coastal band of West Africa that stretches from Lagos to Abidjan in Ivory Coast, 600 miles. There will be 500 million people living in this coastal band within the next 60 years. 500 million people. This is going to be the most intensely urbanized stretch of terrain anywhere in the world. I do not imagine myself that Lagos is going to mean in 20, 40, 60 years what Lagos means today, or that Cotonou next door is going to resemble anything like the Cotonou that we have known up until this point in the history of neighboring Benin, or that little sliver tiny Togo is going to be any longer the pristine kind of classic nation state that was imposed on Africans under the Berlin and its aftermath by Europeans. The sort of flag nations, flag states that were created by Europeans are going to be shaken up by this. And this has the potential, this is not going to happen by itself, but it has the potential to unleash extraordinary energies. I was in Ghana this summer, and I talked to some Nigerians in Ghana this summer, one of whom said something extraordinarily interesting to me. He said, you know, I've only been coming to Ghana for the last year or two, but before I began coming here, I always thought that Ghana was our neighbor, meaning right next door to Nigeria. He said, those other countries, Togo and Benin, I never thought about them before. And there are many things one could say about that, but one of them is that the balkanization of Africa under the Berlin design, the creation of these kind of checkerboard states, French here, English here, French here, English here, has induced Africans, especially in West Africa, to turn their backs toward each other. Not to think of it as going to someplace exotic. It's something very special to think of an Anglophone wanting to go to a Francophone country and vice versa. I had a dinner conversation last night. A good friend of mine here said, so what do you make of these French countries? You're going to discover that, all of you, with each other, in a way that will become unavoidable very soon, because the growth of population is going to submerge the border, and it is going to force new solutions, and it's going to create new markets, and it's going to unleash new energies. And Africans have to be consequential to themselves and to have to live up to the potential that this creates for themselves, because the potential is really, truly an enormous thing.
Kojo, you have the final word.
I mean, I wish that could be the final word, because that was fantastic. I would just want to echo everything that Howard mentioned, and also maybe reorientate our gaze not just to the future and to those new concepts and new possibilities and new imaginings and new constellations that are going to come over the next few decades from this particular part of the world, which they very much are, but also think about some of those stories and those concepts and those ideas from the very recent past that Howard, I think, kind of hinted towards when he talked about the work of Kwame Nkrumah, talked about the work of Patrice Lumumba, talked about the work of Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, that when we look at those resources, there are often ideas and concepts that very much seem ahead of their time now, that were never given the ability to actually manifest into their full potential. You know, one we might think of is even the concept of third worldism as a concept. You know, by the time that I started growing up in the 1990s and 2000s, third worldism was seen to be third world was seen very much as an insult. You know, there was very much a kind of hierarchical idea of the world. You know, the first world, capitalist world, second world, communist world, third world for all the kind of uncivilized savages who couldn't look after themselves. It meant poverty, it meant famine, it meant disease, it meant destitution. But when you go back to the 1970s, this idea of third worldism is seen as almost a new possibility of how the world could rearrange itself, a third world, an alternative constellation of our globe. It's something that drew together not just countries in the kind of geographical band of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, but all people who were kind of committed to this imagining of the new world. You know, kind of organizations like the Black Panther Party in the United States of America were third worldist in their orientation. The kind of new left of, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre or Tariq Ali were third worldist in their orientation. And when we look at some of the products of that third world movement, we look at things like the new International Economic Order resolution that was passed in the United Nations, led by people like Julius Nyerere and Michael Manley in Jamaica. Some of the provisions of that resolution look absolutely radical to today. We're talking about the guarantee of a right to food. We're talking about the control of transnational corporations by every local government. We're talking about protection of the environment and of guarantee of clean water supplies. So many of the resolutions, if we look back at that particular document in the 1970s, speak to the challenges of climate change in 2022, speak to the challenges of the migration crisis in 2022. But that particular resolution was killed in the United Nations very much by the rise of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, what we might call neoliberalism nowadays, that emergence in the North Atlantic corner. But now, people in the United States and the United Kingdom are wrestling with questions of climate change, wrestling with questions of migration crisis, wrestling with questions of runaway wealth inequality, wrestling with questions of the unaccountability of private corporate capitalism. And I would argue that they would do a lot worse than to look for answers to those questions in the place that has been so long ignored, right here on the African continent, right here in the third world, right here in the resources that have been cultivated by the people who have been at the very front line of a lot of these issues that we're all going to be wrestling with over the next few decades.
Well, thank you both so much, and thank you for listening. All right, just one question. All right, please go ahead.
If you shout, we could repeat it. If you shout, we could repeat it.
Okay. Okay. So first, I would like to congratulate you because you are really brilliant. And the question is, do you think a new decolonization is needed in Africa? And could it be a great event of the 21st century?
We have, the two of us have mentioned Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana repeatedly in this conversation, and Kwame Nkrumah and his theory of neocolonialism was, in essence, that the imperial powers of Europe figured out a way of maintaining economic control of their former colonies without the fuss and bother of having to try to maintain political control and all of the costs that that incurred to them, right? I believe we are still living within that system. And I believe that for Africa to arrive at the moment of hope that it awaits, it most definitely will have to break out of that system. And so I don't sit before you as somebody with the answer to every question, but that's the goal. The goal is for Africa to arrive at an economic dispensation that offers it every bit as much freedom as its political dispensation since 1957 may seem on the surface to offer it.
Absolutely, and I think that just to, again, echo what Howard mentioned, I think particularly the reason why I look at the British Empire above the French and the Belgian Empire and a lot of its other European rivals is that the British Empire, I think, was most skillful in using private capital and that sphere of private capital to maintain control over the empires whilst having a kind of dressing of statecraft and political control on the top of it. And so whilst Britain had control over the Gold Coast in Ghana, it was the Ashanti Goldfields Corporation that did so much of the work of maintaining that. Whilst Britain had, control over Iran, it was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that did so much of the work of that. And so that makes the actual transition of political control and the transition of statecraft that happened in the mid-20th century decolonization movement simply the removal of the dressing of empire whilst maintaining in place the actual architecture that facilitated so much of that extraction of wealth. And I think that the reinforcement of that subterranean architecture of private capital is now at the heart of so many of the issues that we're facing all across the world, not just in the African continent where they're wrestling with wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is now a debate in the United Kingdom on the news every single day. Not just in terms of the inability to hold tax revenue within a jurisdiction. Now the offshoring of wealth and the privatization of tax exemption is a debate that's going on in Britain every day in the news today. And so we can talk about a new decolonization movement for Africa, and I think that's absolutely essential, but I think in the 21st century, we might even be in a place where the rest of the world is thinking we might need a whole decolonization movement as well. And to kind of make this really concrete, to make it very clear, we can look at how the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in the 1950s overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in order to stop him being able to use or nationalize the refineries in the Abadan region in order to be able to fund a kind of welfare state, to be able to fund education, health policies that were happening, that he wanted to implement in Iran in 2022. The inability for a democratically elected government to control the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had devastating impacts for people of Iran in the 1950s. Now in 2022, there's an energy crisis in the United Kingdom where everyday people are literally having to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children. There are old people who are choosing to ride on buses because that's the only way they're going to be able to stay warm over the winter because they're unable to heat their own homes. And at the same time, the legacy of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now BP, the largest oil company in the world, is recording record profits in its history. its own chief executive described the energy crisis as turning his company into, I quote here, a cash machine. And so there we can see the consequences of the legacy of not confronting the real architecture of empire, that architecture of private capital, having an impact on people even in Britain today. And so I think that provides an opportunity maybe for people to hear the arguments of decolonization even in the West in a way that they couldn't hear and couldn't understand it in the 1950s and 1960s and even the 1970s. Maybe not.
Sorry, we sort of have to get things moving, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Can you turn your tags round so that, yes, that's the one. Howard didn't bring his. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kovier. Thank you, Kojo. Thank you, Howard. Excellent. Please come this way. This way. You're grabbing your bag. If you want to buy their books, you can just follow them downstairs. And we're going straight into the next discussion. You all know MI. African. What's that song? African microphone magician. African rapper, that's the one. So he's joining us along with Nels Abbey and Namdi Ahirim. So I'm just waiting for them to arrive. I invite the audience to come and take these spaces in front. I would really appreciate that. It's always good for the photographs. If you can just come forward to that one. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. It's an award. Yes, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it. So if the beautiful people over here could come over here, I would love that. Oh, are you all here? Fantastic. Okay, so we're ready for the next. Oh, you're even playing his music for me. Hey!
And they say I'm the best side. I'm on top of the rest side. Cash is clear what I do to the list side. Rappers are vexed chasing me with a vest.
You just got married, eh?
Kicking up Pepsi, not a threat side.
Fantastic. Say congratulations to him now. Join me in welcoming to the stage M.I. Abaga and Wisdom author, all-round genuine dude, Namdi Ahirim, author of Prince of Monkeys. And unfortunately, Derek Owusu isn't able to join us. And we got a very sweet letter letting us know why. And we send him our love and our best wishes. And Mr. Nels Abbey, author of Think Like a White Man, has agreed to step in. We want to grill these men. What goes on in a man's head? Why do they behave the way? Oh, sorry. And to speak to them is the gorgeous Chiku Kimeria, here all the way from Kenya.
None of the men got an applause like that. I don't know what's happening here.
Oh, thank you all. Thank you, Lola, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really looking forward to today's panel. So just another round of applause for this wonderful, wonderful panel. So as you might have noticed, there's one thing that the whole panel has in common. They are Nigerians. But they are also men. Anyway, in the interest of time, I will jump into the first question, and we can go in this order. What, in your work, what's the importance, or what do you think of vulnerability? What's the importance of vulnerability in your work? And as a man in this field, is there something like too much vulnerability? So, MI, we can start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to be here. I'm very glad to have been asked, especially to talk about these sort of conversations. I'm very glad to see that it's becoming more of a common thing for you to hear conversations around, you know, men and vulnerability and how we feel and mental health and stuff like that. Because I do think, when I look at my life, I know that the closer I've gotten to understanding myself and being more vulnerable, that the better people around me have said I've become to them. I've been able to be more self-aware and listen and make changes. And I think that sometimes, especially in hip-hop, sometimes men feel that the only route to vulnerability is through art. And so I think in rap, you see that a lot of that. I was listening to rap songs that I grew up to when I was like 15, 16 years old. This particular rapper I really loved, DMX. DMX was the most graphic. He would say the craziest things. And then he said these lyrics. He said, I wasn't given the chance of being a child with a father. My only talent is being able to survive when things get harder. My balance in the high beams of life keep my dreams afloat, and that's why I hit the streets at night. And even as a young person, I understood what that meant. It meant he had a lot of feeling, a lot of pain, and the only way he knew how to do it was to act it out and do these things. And so I do believe that art, if ever there was one, has been the place for vulnerability, especially for men. It's a place that people can go there when they may not feel that they can be honest about who they are. We create these avatars. We create these stories about ourselves that we share with the world. But I will add to say that the more I have found ways to express my vulnerability in real life, the better I feel I have tools to approach creating art. And it's something that, whereas I had a lot of emotion and passion earlier on, now I have a lot more insight and more perspective, and I think it deepens the art. So I hope I answered. Did I answer the whole gamut of the question? Yeah.
You did. Can there be too much vulnerability?
Too much vulnerability. How do we measure this? I think that it's sort of like one of these questions where the answer is we're human beings, right? And that you have to make the determination in your life what's stopping you from moving forward. Are you at a point where you're over-expressive and you're trying to just get people to see things from your point of view? Or are you at a point where you can't move forward because of trauma and pain and you do need someone to hear you? And it's contextual in every moment, right? But I would say for where we are now, through my eyes, through my dark shaded eyes, I would say that we should say no, because I think we are over leveraged on being strong and being macho and being toxic. And so maybe, I assume that there is. I assume that in every relationship and for every artist, there's too much. But I think that we're starting from a deep deficit, and that as we head our ways backwards, like the assumption that just be vulnerable, I think it's the right assumption for where we are today, my opinion.
Thank you. Over to Nelson, the author of, isn't this a brilliant title, Think Like a White Man? Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today. Most people have probably never heard of me, so I'd just like to explain that I am a a London-born, Yoruba-educated Shikiri boy, and it's a delight to be here. So in terms of vulnerability, I grew up, I was born in London in the 80s, and at the time, a lot of Nigerian parents had this idea that handing your children over to white foster parents was the way to raise them. That lost fashion around 1990. Then they had this idea that sending your children back home to go to a tough boarding school would be a great way to raise them. So every Nigerian parental experiment, I was a subject of it. So by 1992, 1993, I found myself in a place called Abeokuta, or as my dad sold it to me, the city of Abeokuta, in a really tough boarding school called Baptist Boys High School. And I went to the same school as Abiola and Obasanjo, and I admired those guys. And because that's what we were groomed to be like. Those were our templates of success. And if you go back to, for one moment to me in particular, if you go back to, say, the Abacha era, and you look at people like Obasanjo were being arrested, and they were being arrested for coup plotting and all sorts of rubbish, whether right or wrong, whatever happened. But I just remembered my dad and everybody else, my teachers, showing us how Obasanjo was acting and behaving throughout that whole period, that he never broke, he never crumbled, he never showed any nervousness. He was just straightforward, hard as nails. Then came the Oputa panel. And when Obasanjo showed up there to come and speak, which is a rare thing for a Nigerian head of state to do, the chair said to him, "Would you like to take a seat?" And he said, "I'd rather stand, thank you very much." And I just thought to myself, this guy is something else. And he never showed an ounce of vulnerability whatsoever. And I thought to myself, if I was going through it, so in my life, in looking at him, and us in school being pointed out, that's who you should, that's your pedigree, that's what you're being groomed to be, essentially. And I thought to myself, every other moment I felt scared no matter what, to the point where if a teacher just pulls out his cane, which was almost every other minute, I was as scared as it gets. But to see, I think as I've grown older, and as I've grown more, as I've grown to become a dad, as I've grown to become a better brother unto my sisters, better partner unto my lady and everybody else or so, I think the idea of understanding vulnerability and having an appreciation for its purpose, for its regulatory purpose in a man in particular, and recognizing its power to make you do better and make you understand people and accrue some degree of empathy is something that I think I've really come to cherish a lot more. And in my works of art, be it Think Like a White Man, be it the other things I do also, it's practically all one big act of vulnerability, almost insanely so sometimes.
Thank you. And over now to you, Namdi.
Yeah, I think like this is one of those situations where you're in class and a few people answer first, and when it's your turn, you say they've said it all, right? So it's really one of those situations, but I would definitely build on what they've said. I think it's very interesting that like both M.I. and Nelson spoke to upbringing, and particularly in writing and in literature, right, we are told, write what you know. And if you look at it, right, if people have been writing what they know, if we look at what African literature tells us is an African man, right? If I say, what is an African man? There's a fair chance we all have the same picture in our head, right? So an entire generation have bought into, generations before them, right? And the generations that fathered us bought into this very monolithic perspective of what it is to be an African man, right? And I think going forward, it's more of me thinking in my own work, not necessarily critiquing, right, because it's valid. It worked for them and served them and it had its place. But it's what else is there, right? What else can we explore? What else can we represent? What else can we validate? Because there is a lot more, there's a wide breadth of masculine feelings. There is courage and boldness and ambition and just being an African man, right? But there is also vulnerability, there is romance, there is fear, there is illness, right? There are so many things we can explore. And I think fiction allows, offers a very solid avenues to do that, right? So that's what we try to achieve. That's what I try to achieve in my own work. It's a thing where not necessarily critiquing what exists, but how can we showcase? So obviously, it starts from the very personal perspective, right? What else am I feeling in my own life that I want to showcase or represent? Like Emma said as well, it's an opportunity to showcase your own vulnerability through art. And if they ask you, oh, are you really good? You're like, nah, it's fiction. It's fiction. Like, yeah, it's not my real story. It's not my real feelings, that kind of thing. So to a fair degree, create an umbrella to ask certain questions, to challenge certain things, and to see what else we can represent.
Wonderful. So I think so far we've started with theory, but now to practice. So if you're on this panel, it's because you have actually shown vulnerability in a world that expects you to be macho. So for both of you, for Namdi and also for Nelson, the question would be, what has been your most vulnerable work and how was it received? And I'll tweak it a bit for MI. So for MI, it will be, what has been the most vulnerable part of your career that you've lived? Because you're all celebrities, right? You're a celebrity, so I'm sure your struggles have been public. So what has been the most vulnerable part of your career that people have seen publicly, and how did people react to these struggles? We can start, I think this time we can go around this way.
Okay. So I think to a fair degree, all of my work has explored my own personal life and feelings. I think one of the earlier things I did that pretty much broke the mold was when I wrote about my experience with alcohol, right? And it's pretty interesting to say, because I say I wrote this a while ago, and I appear relatively young as well. But I think it was something I thought was necessary to write, because I think alcohol and drinks in general, but predominantly alcohol, plays a very important role in male relationships, right? So under the guise of alcohol, men would gather, and they would discuss everything from fears to ambition to family issues. As I wrote in the essay, right, if you're having issues with your girl, you may not just call up your guy and tell him about it and ask questions, but if you guys are drinking beer, you can ask those questions and it's calm, right? If you're broke at the moment, right, you may not necessarily call your guy and ask for help, but if you guys are drinking beer, you could do it over beer, right? So it was just exploring how, okay, this is an avenue in the real world we use to explore the vulnerable side of our masculinity, and it was me interrogating that on paper. And I think it was it broke the mold in the sense that it was the first time I wrote something that people could metaphorically hold my shit and say, this is you, right? So it's things where you have to confront people in your personal life. So your parents, who are relatively conservative, other members of the relatively conservative society we live in, right? So you're challenging people's sense of pride, right? To a fair degree, challenging people's egos as well, right? So when you're telling people, okay, this, the way you approach things is, you're using this as a crutch, right? And how can you explore healthier ways of expressing your vulnerabilities and having to have conversations with people that I know in my real life as well, but people who came up to me saying, okay, I relate with this, right? Where do we go from here? How could we build on this?
Thanks. Nelson, over to you.
Yeah, so for me, it's, so I wrote a book called Think Like a White Man, which was about my crazy days when I was a banker. It was about the things that you had to go through as a black person in a white country, in the whitest place in the white country, which is in the corporate world. And in terms of vulnerability, I think it made me more vulnerable and a lot more fragile too at the same time. And I think that was certainly a vulnerable act in terms of my art or so. But something I did yesterday, that came out yesterday, which you probably haven't seen or heard yet, I made a documentary on boarding schools. Which is one of Britain's very, very most successful and enduring colonial exports. So Britain invented the concept of the boarding school and then sent it right the way around the world. And I explored boarding schools from the schools I went to over here, of course, the boarding schools I went to, which were Mayflower and Baptist Boys High School, and then But I was looking in places like Kenya, Chimota in Ghana, then the old boarding schools in Britain, Eton, Winchester, Harrow, which so many Nigerians go to, by the way, which is a very surprising thing. A lot of Nigerian parents send their children to these schools for very, very dark reasons. Not, well, dark reasons, but for very interesting reasons, which I think you should listen to the documentary about. But for me, being in a boarding school, being taken away from my family as a very young person, and then being put in that environment was the most vulnerable I'd ever felt. And I think that vulnerability from boarding school was the basis of practically everything I've experienced throughout my entire life. So speaking about some of my experiences in public going to boarding school, I think also some of the points I've got, in terms of being a man, when a man walks inside the room, you want the man to portray himself and conduct himself like a man, like a winner. Are you with me? That's the person you admire, you want to get with if you're a woman or so, or a man if you're into men. Or that's the person that you just look up to in the room, the person who walks inside the room and conducts and carries themselves like a winner. Like, yeah, okay, I'm winning. When 50 Cent walks inside the room, he looks like a winner. Are you with me? When Barack Obama walks inside the room, he looks like a winner. That's the way it goes. So, and I think that, whatever I do in all my work or so, no matter how vulnerable I might be personally feeling at any given time, I still feel that very, very big need to almost disguise it, to pretend as if I'm winning no matter what. But the problem with it too, at the same time, when I did my work on boarding schools, it was that one time where I just literally couldn't disguise it with satire or humor or anything else. It was just straightforward. This is what it is, and pretty much this was quite a, almost a factor of vulnerability for me, and here we are today.
I think that's a great segue for me to say what I was going to say. I think 2019 and 2020, if I were to name those 2 years, I would call them the deconstruction of the ego of MI. And if you remember, like if you're a fan of mine, when I came on the scene, there was just like a ball of confidence. I was coming from Jos, and it was real. I was coming from a place where it was statistically close to impossible to make it in music at the time. And not only did I make it, I brought my family with me. I moved everyone to Lagos. We established a label. We built execs from it, and I was winning, you know, in every single way, and became a label president. And then 3 things happened in 3 different, put them in buckets. Number 1 is I had a very traumatic split with my business partners, which had been a lot of my identity, because you think MI, you think Chocolate City, you think. And the second thing was that a lot of my personal relationships started unraveling. This was hidden under the MI, you know, you're a star, firstborn son, you've seen the world a certain way the whole time, you treat women a certain way, especially when you can basically have access to female companionship at any time, anywhere. And the third thing was also the world just changed so quickly. Streaming, everything just happened. And here I was standing and asking myself, is there anything more for me to do in music? And who am I if I can no longer produce albums? And it's so funny, as I was listening here talking to them, listening to them talking, that a year before, 2018, I had made an album called The Study of Self-Worth. But I had made the album as an observer. A friend of mine was depressed, suicidal, and watching her, I decided to learn more, and I wrote about these things. And then I had a conversation with a counselor, and I recorded bits of it. And so a lot of people met me, and they were like, bro, you're going through what I'm going through. But frankly, I was an observer. I hadn't had a real moment where my ego had been deconstructed. And so there's an album, even the most ardent MI fans, I'm sure this is the lowest one on their list, it's called the Judah EP. And in there is the most, Jude deconstructed completely. One of the songs is called Blood. It's about deep betrayal. It didn't do well. And this is the thing I think you were talking about, is that what bothers me a lot is I don't know if, especially in the society where I am, if society is really comfortable with men adding vulnerability as part of their everyday. We talk about it, we have these meetings, but even when we're talking, I'm not trying to call anybody out, but early on when we started talking and we're talking about feelings and our background, I saw almost every woman's head went to their phone. And it was a trigger for me. Maybe you guys were tweeting or whatever, but it was a trigger for me because so often when I try to talk about how I feel, I see that instantly, this is an experience that has no interest, has low value on the thing. You know how our brain is just like, what is happening here? How do we exit this place? And I find then that what I do is then to go to ego. And that can be, depending on trauma, it can be, pardon my French, it can be fuck you, you don't know me, glasses on, chilling. Or it could be anger, And I say that because vulnerable. About it. If you have a feeling and you can't talk about it, and you can't hear yourself say to yourself, I'm angry because, if society says, we're not there for that, we want you to be a winner, we want you to provide, and I know that we're the room that should say, I'm telling you that in your own relationships, probably, if there's a man that you respect in your life, you probably haven't created space for them to talk about how they feel. You probably have never even had that conversation with your dad or like your uncle or the breadwinner, this person you've always seen as a strong person, and sort of the dichotomy of like this polarity of ego, because the Judah EP was, again, another MI fan tidbit. One of the records that was created for it is the height of ego. It's a song called Viper, Where I'm Going at Vector. It's the height. The lyrics literally say, I swear by my name because there is no higher authority. I will not destroy you. Instead, I'll give you maturity. You're so, like, I'm talking from almost godlike, and at the same time, there's intense vulnerability. It shows you, like, at the point where you're your weakest, you bring out this, like, you return to ego. And I don't know if there's something useful in there. I was just listening to you guys talk, and what bubbled up came out, and I wanted to share it.
Yeah, I think it's very important what you said, right? I think anytime as a man we get vulnerable in our work, it's definitely a battle against ego, right? And when there is backlash, is ego in the audience speaking back, right? And the way I tend to approach it is, and I've had this conversation with my brother many times, it's this instance, right? You're in a space of friends, right? And for instance, you're the more progressive one out of everybody else, right? We still have a fair amount of learnings to do, but maybe you read the book first, right? And you're the more progressive one. And one of your friends says something out of line or does something out of line, right? You could do the easy thing and laugh about it and walk away and let society handle him, right? Or you can confront the situation. And what I've learned is, in my group of friends, right, they are more likely to pay attention when I speak than when someone from outside the circle speaks, right? When someone from outside the circle speaks, it's, you don't know me like that. Like you said, shades on, right? When someone from inside the circle speaks, right, you pay more attention, right? You're more sensitive to what's being said. You know it's a safe space, you know it's not an attack, right? So when I engage in my audience, I imagine that we are one circle, right? And it's, I can speak to you with empathy and with kindness, because you're more likely to listen to me than to the next man, right? If you're checking for my book, right, there's a fair amount of respect. If anyone is listening to your album, there's a fair amount of respect. And with all learning, right, is a very gentle journey of attrition, where it's not the first time the argument is made that is being said, right? They always stone the first preacher in town. They always stone the first preacher in town. But it's a very gentle journey of attrition. When you're having, so also what you said, right, in terms of people around you creating a safe space and you creating a safe space for people. You never tell someone, trust me, for the first time and they trust you, right? Again, it's a very gentle journey of attrition. So like with vulnerability in our work, it's, the way I approach it is, okay, I'll speak kindly, right? I'm not critiquing. I'm saying, what if you look at it this way, right? And I trust them to respect and engage as well. If they don't, I look at it as a gentle journey of attrition, right? Maybe when I speak about it next year, maybe when your girlfriend speaks about it, would make progress, right? But it's an entire, it's a very complicated process.
And I know there are questions from the audience, but before that, I have one specific question for each panelist member. So I'll start with you, Namdi. In your book, Prince of Monkeys, one of the things that you really see is this fatherhood wound and the fact that, you know, as men or as African men, you learn to be a man from your father or your male figure. But tying this to the previous session, maybe your father was someone who lived through colonial times or suffered a lot of loss during, you know, the Civil War. Maybe his father was someone who was sent to fight in World War I or World War II. So how do you think of vulnerability and the idea of who you are as an African man when you're also thinking about the fatherhood, what you've learned from your fathers?
I think it's a very tricky thing to be an African man now, because you have to understand that there aren't any clear templates. And when I say that, it's similar to what I represented in the book, right? We have to understand that the templates that were given to us are insufficient by default. They're insufficient. I think over the past decades, we've seen the idea of the African woman evolve, right? We've seen a lot of theory on feminism, a lot of advocacy, things in practice. When you look at masculinity, it's not received the same energy, right? And so speaking directly to the book and to my own life, right? So my dad went through the Civil War, and it's always very easy for me to say, okay, you can love me better, you can do things in this way and in that ways that I would prefer. But the day my eyes opened and I became a lot more determined to find my own path was when I thought about the type of fatherhood he received. For context, his own father was born in 1905, right? So his father received a very different type of fatherhood experience. In a very fast-changing world, he tried to immerse a lot of new things, right? And now the world is changing even faster, right? So there is absolutely no way this man is going to give me exactly what I need for like 2022 African masculinity, right? It's very similar to what we're doing. Thank you. Yeah, it's very similar to what we're doing in politics, right? Where we see very, very aging leaders and we know they are insufficient to provide the type of guidance we need. So this is the same thing on a very domestic level. So it's a tricky thing for young African men now, because while we respect everything that has been done before, we have to come to terms with the fact that it's insufficient. We can't confront it because we are confronting ego. There's no way forward, right? But we have to work around it and we have to build forward. And I think that also creates a very urgent need for, I wouldn't call it mentorship, because young men don't really learn by being told, they learn by observing, right? So it puts a lot of pressure to always put the right foot forward, right? Because the other young men around you are watching and they're observing, and especially like when there are folks like us to relative degrees in the spotlight, you know that like people are paying attention, right? You know if you speak with kindness, it's a teaching point. If you speak with anger and ego, it's also a teaching point as well.
Great response. Thank you so much. And so for Nelson, you talk about, you know, the type of man who, when he gets in, everyone knows the man has arrived.
I'm not sure I'm that type of man. I think I'm the opposite. I wish I was.
No, but so you talk about that as the idea of, you know, strong black man, how you should look. But also when you write Think Like a White Man, there's the reality that in these corporate spaces, the black man is not at the top, but you're still trying to fight. You have your ego, which wants to make you feel like, you know, you're someone, but you're also fighting supremacy, like white supremacy in this context. So for you, how do you reflect on that?
I think it's a very, very good question. So it's a different world. So in Nigeria, I even said in the book, there's no such thing as black people in Nigeria. They're just Nigerians. And you're very lucky in that regard because it's the complexities that you have in terms of navigating society are a lot more straightforward. That's one of the things I loved when I moved to Nigeria when I was younger, that, oh my God, I wouldn't be that black boy in the class anymore. And suddenly when I got here, I quickly learned that there's this thing called Yoruba people, Hausa people, and Igbo people, and I was Shikiri. So that, I was pretty minor all over again. But in terms of how you, so it's looking at manhood once again, and I look once again at, if I look at the template that was, as you mentioned, that was given to us by some of our leaders, for example, the good ones, or the ones who were fairly effective, it's not that many in terms of Nigerian history. And, but if you take a look at Obasanjo for a particular, if I go back to the 90s, because that was a period that was so fascinating to me, if he broke down and cried, or showed some degree of vulnerability, or if he just, there's some people who did, who begged Abacha to basically forgive them or so. If he didn't stand up how he stood or so, or conduct himself in the manner in which he would, I really can't see how he would have come back and become, say, a Nigerian president again. I think he would have become a bit of a ridiculous figure. But I think the same way too when I look at my own father and I look at people around us or so, I look at MI, I look at Namdi, I look at just pretty much everything that we go through. And we look at the strength that men are still required to show. And I do think, and I was even if I was to ask the audience, if you've ever seen our fathers as African people are almost majestic figures sometimes. They conduct themselves with a certain degree of absolute masculinity, which I think is very different from what you actually see often in the West. Often in the West, black men are reduced to boys. And I hate to say it, they're reduced to children. And children are sometimes treated like adults. It's a very unique thing. But when you then take a look at your father in the African context, and think, so when the last time you ever saw your father shed tears or cry or so? And it's a very, very rare-ish type of thing. And I just remember even how my friends' parents were almost spoken of too. I think to myself that, I think of how my friends' parents, who were very successful, well-to-do, strong men, winning men, it's the exact same thing I looked up to them about. And I still admire all these men to this very day. And I just think that the way in which how they convey the difficulty of being a man in this society, which has immense difficulties, at the same time to immense patriarchal power compared to, say, women. Even if you look around all the posters that you see for who's running for political office, it's all men exclusively, nobody whatsoever, no one else whatsoever. So it does put it in perspective to me that I do think that, yeah, vulnerability certainly has a huge place in my life, but how I express it and how I can actually walk inside the room and conduct myself and portray myself or so in order to get the most out of the room and remain influential. It's a difficult balancing act. It's one that I'm not particularly good at balancing, but I do my best.
Thank you. And so the final question, thank you. The final question is for MI before we open up for Q&A. So I loved the fact that you started first by speaking about DMX, because I think DMX was one of those figures whose struggles were so public. Especially I remember when he went on Iyanla Fix My Life, and some of the people said, okay, we love that you're trying to address your issues, but there's also a lot of people who were scared of this, because if DMX can crumble and cry in front of Iyanla, what does that mean about, black manhood in general? But it makes me think, I would love to hear your thoughts given the sector you're in, or the field you're in, hip hop. It's not really a field that encourages men in their feelings. And so how do you navigate this as a hip hop artist?
That's a great question. Is it that dichotomy again of we are seeing the vulnerability. You're seeing it. You're seeing these monuments to ego. People hiding behind, creating these avatars to say, if you won't allow me, if I can't feel it in a healthier way, I will hide it and create this picture of myself that I'll show the world, that has guns, tattoos, that is impervious to pain. So we're seeing it like that. Hip hop is vulnerability unexpressed. I'll say three things, three small lessons of vulnerability that have shaped my own story. And number one is, my dad, when I was younger, used to say, it was just the weirdest thing, he used to say to us all the time, you guys are the most handsome boys. So when I went to primary school, I just thought I was the best looking guy. Like, and this year, I was overwhelmed. And what happens to you when you're overwhelmed is like how our brain functions. It's almost like you start preparing to die, like depression, you know. And at a point, I was getting married. I didn't have me and my fiancée at the time, she had moved from Geneva. She was settling in Lagos. It was just so much. And I remember sitting on my balcony one day, and I didn't know if I was going to, you know how your brain, if you've ever been in this moment, your brain starts to close in on you, and your options get smaller. And I went back to this thing that my dad would say to me. When I would run in the morning, I would just say, you're a handsome guy. You're a good person. And this small thing gave me the energy I need to put one foot in front of the other, right? It's critical. It's me and my feelings. The second one is my niece. She just turns 18 today, actually, Jade. She taught me how to listen the right way. She'd come and say, Uncle, I know you want to solve my problems. I want you to listen to me for an hour and a half. And then she would just talk. I would have all sorts of feelings. She was having all sorts of feelings. But what she was doing was she was saying, I'm clogged up and I need to unclog myself. And she would just talk through it. I'd never in my life seen this. These ladies, they know it, they do it too. They do it all the time. They sit with themselves. We watch football. We're doing something else. We're playing game. And I would just sit and listen. And what did I learn? How did it affect my craft? When I needed to change things in my career, to be at the moment where I am now with a new album, new project, looking forward, developing a new platform for creatives and growing, all these skills that I didn't have and I needed to acquire rapidly, I learned how to listen and how to be ashamed because I didn't know something and just sit with it but still keep listening and not walk out of the room. And that is this part of the reason I'm here. And the last one, thank you. And the last one is about crying. And you see, the reason why I talk about this, I cry, and it's like maybe once every 6 months, right? I cried when Michael Jordan was talking about Kobe Bryant. I ran up to my room self to go and cry. You know what I'm saying? I was like, this is gonna be good, better have a great cry. You know what I mean? Went upstairs. But I really cried when my last relationship, before I got into this, I really wept. As soon as she was like, I'm not doing this anymore, immediately I was like, pardon my French, fuck you, glasses on, chill. And a friend of mine was like, you're doing it again. You're doing the thing again. And so I decided to do something different. I went to therapy. And I cried. I wept. My first 3 sessions, I was weeping. And I was weeping because I was letting go of a safe thing I'd always done. Since I was a child, when I felt abandoned, I'd been like, I don't care about you, and I would go and this had made me cheat on partners. It had made me walk out of things that I'd done my whole life. But it was my safe space. It's the thing I built when I was maybe 2 years old that I've had with me my whole time. It was no longer helpful to me. Think about our governments, about all these men that lead us, about them staying on things that no longer work, right? And I come back to this moment where I just needed to cry, to let go of something that I'd been stubbornly holding on to, because that's what happens when you lose something that you care about. You cry. And if you don't cry, then you're stuck. What do I do? Do I let go? And then you stay in this harmful, maybe acting to your partner a certain way, or because it's something that's precious to you. This coping mechanism is precious to you. And these moments of vulnerability. Now, how do I see myself? I see myself as a lion. One of the most confident, strong people. I live my life today believing that I almost believe I'm gonna die in the next 10 minutes. So I'm like, what can I do now? I wanna do more. I wanna get this. I wanna get on the phone. I wanna build a new project. And I'm that way. I'm my best self, my most like productive, my most winning self. Like I feel I'm stepping into a new state. Like I married someone that I would never, like I've had the opportunity to. And when I met her, she was like, yeah, I don't do rappers. I was like, we'll see about that. You know what I mean? Right? And just a new person. And I did it because I learned how to cry. I learned how to sit with my feelings while I listen. And I learned to be just sweet to myself in almost a childlike way and be like, you know, you're a handsome guy. You're a good person. And that to me is why vulnerability is so important, because it makes men more manly in the way that society needs them to be when it needs them to be. Do you know what I'm saying? It makes you better. It makes you stronger. It makes you able to give more. It makes you able to listen more, to share more. You know what I mean? Like this one thing that we needed a lot when we were back then, to lift things, which is no longer as, you know, to lift things or punch or push back. This is no longer as important. You know what I mean? We're basing so much about how should we act around that. And I think that as we have these conversations more, I mean, it's back to what you were saying about opening, you know, that gradual, you know, that gradual process. As we have it more, I encourage my brothers that are here that personally, for the sake of your relationship, for the sake of your community, for the sake of your country, but most importantly, for yourself, so that you have the opportunity to be your best self. Someone that can explore new ideas, somebody that can, you know, one more thing, I feel like I've been going on for a bit, but I just want to say something. I was talking to someone I really love, who I've been building a relationship with recently, a younger guy, like a brother to me in the music business. And he asked me a question. He said, what do I do when I've disappointed someone and I'm not looking forward to the conversation? It's such a vulnerable question. You know, I messed up. What do I do now? Do I run away? Which is the thing that he always did. He would just be like, well, this business deal, I wasn't feeling it anymore. I'm someone that if I'm feeling the vibe is off, I just move. You know what I'm saying? And it affected his business, it affected his career. And he asked me this question, and I said, you deserve to see the version of yourself that can sit and say, hey, I take accountability, I messed up, but I would like to try again. You deserve to see, and I think we all do. You know what I mean? And I really do think that the door there isn't through bodybuilding, isn't it through like your accomplishments or how much you make, that the door there is through understanding yourself, understanding the part of you that's your emotions, how you feel when someone talks to you, understanding that, building some skills about managing that and improving on that, and being able to share, finding places where you're able to safely share how you feel, because that's part of the healthy human experience, you know.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Honestly, a huge, huge round of applause for the panelists. I think you've been amazing. I can't see the timer, but I hope we have time for a question or two. Two questions. Okay, perfect. Yes?
Good afternoon, Mr. Incredible. I'm a long life fan of yours. Like, I remember every line from the hardcore stuff. And I love you because of the hardcore stuff, you know. So when you came out with, you were talking about your feelings. I won't lie, I wasn't really feeling it, because you're like, Abdul and I were just talking about it. You're like my rap god. You're the guy who came from Jos, who conquered Lagos. You know, you're Nigeria's rap messiah, all those things. You know, it's only you. We are looking up to you. You are the chairman. You've evolved, yeah? You've evolved. So we are your fans. How do we now evolve with you? Because I'm asking because, you know, I love you, I'm your diehard. You know, like I said, I've been listening to you from the beginning of your career, Chocolate City, everything. But you've conditioned us to expect the chairman. You've conditioned me to expect Mr. Incredible. So if as it was very difficult for me to sit down and listen to you talk about that, you cry. Yes, you know, you know, the human being in me empathizes with you. I sympathize with you, my brother, but I'm your fan. and I pay money to hear hardcore bars. So please, my question to you is, please, how can we now follow you on this journey of vulnerability? Because it's difficult. Thank you, sir.
Yes, you can respond.
I mean, it's such a great question. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for also making us all laugh. You know, it's a, not just me, right? It's, look at all the stars. It's the same thing. Now let me tell you what's going to happen. All those stars are going to discover as they go in their life that the picture of themselves that they're putting out is not real. And that their real life needs for them to acquire skills, maturity as they grow. And at that stage, it is okay if your fan base don't understand. It's okay. I say so gently because I love my fans. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that if you listen to my new album now, it's less of an avatar. Because when I was younger and I would say those things, I alienated my brother Jesse Jacks because I was just so tough. When I made a decision, it's that decision. Same thing with Brimo. And when we sit and we talk, it's about feelings. I wanted to be heard. I wanted my, you know what I mean? So what we saw on the top was, I'm Chocolate City, blah, 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 blah. Right? And what I will say is that the answer for me, is that I have to be okay. And this is why I can make albums and keep going forward. I have to be okay if nobody appreciates the change at first. You know what I mean? I have to be okay with that. But I put it back to you to say that every single, because you're right, you're responding, you know why we respond to stars like that? Because it makes us feel safe. Because we're vulnerable. If that person has it together, if that person is so brave, then I guess the world is going to be okay. It gives us a sense of control, right? What I'm saying to you as well is that MI will be better if he's allowed to be more vulnerable. Maybe that doesn't mean that all his music is emotional. The reason that happened was because I didn't know how to be vulnerable in real life, right? And I had run out of I'm in the club popping bottles. You listen to like the Chairman song, like I listen to it now and it's like like none of those things was true. I was like, I'm a chairman like Richard Branson and I'm not. You know what I'm saying? I was not. But it's like this thing that we say and it makes us feel, but we run out of it in life. You know what I mean? And I think that in a way our society is adults that are not evolving emotionally. You know what I mean? It's like a lot of like, if you just look at our leaders and just look at them posture, you're wrong. You know what I mean? But you're, like, you know what I mean? It's like this, we don't have that door of vulnerability to access that makes society better. So I put it to you that for your husband, if you're married, your brothers, your father, do not have that picture of them. It's an unhealthy picture. It will end with them having hypertension, or them being brutal to their daughters or their wives, or having like extramarital or outside relationships. It will end with them drinking. It will end with them finding different ways to go unhealthy ways, or pouring all their energy into their work. Whereas if they had a place where they could come home and laugh, and if they were upset about something or if they felt jealous, they could be like, you know, that made me feel jealous and it made me feel small. It would make the world better for you. The music and everything would be better for you. And as a fan, you'd have more.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'll request just two very quick questions, one for Nelson, one for Namdi, but very quick. We just have less than 5 minutes to go. Yes, and yes. So we'll take those two. You can ask both questions now, then we'll get the responses. You and Efwa.
Okay. It's kind of for everyone, so do you think vulnerability is for all men? You guys have won, and so if you've won in a way, it's easier to say, you know, I lost along the way, or there were times when I wasn't winning. But for maybe those men who haven't won and don't have their experience to back it up, it's opening that Pandora's box of, these are my emotions without necessarily having the guidance to process them. Is that safer than falling back on, I'm a man and I have to be strong, if they don't have that guidance to get out of that dark place, if that makes sense?
Why are you not in school? A British accent here. I think of myself very young. How? Oh my God! I thought you were about 15 years old or so. I was thinking, why are you not in school? But there we go. Sorry, I'll pass it to Nat.
Over time, that compliment gets more important. I do look 15. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, right? It works under the assumption that we've won, right? So winning is very relative. And the funny thing about life is the goalpost keeps shifting, right? So what you think is a win today may not necessarily be a win when you get there. And living with yourself is coming to terms with the fact that your North Star isn't winning, right? Your North Star is being the best version of yourself, right? And hopefully you win along the way, right? And it makes you comfortable with losing at times. Like, it's a weird thing to say, but it makes you comfortable with losing. And it puts you in a better position to win as well. So, we've all, in many different ways, we've all alluded to it, but I think Emma's last comment pretty much crystallized it in the sense that we need to de-radicalize this concept of the man who always has to win, right? And my reaction to your question is, Emma made it okay, right? So when the next young rapper raps about this type of thing, it's not radical, it's okay. And we need to normalize all this type of alternative perspectives, right? So if I write about this guy who isn't such a star, but he's doing okay, right? It makes it okay for the next person to write about it. And when you read 3 stories like that, it's not so radical when you see it in real life. It's not so radical to aspire to it, right? I have a lot of female friends who say, I'm not really trying to cash out. I just want to be soft and be calm. I don't have any male friend that says that, right? Because you can't. I have male friends that think it, but I don't have male friends that say it. Like, we'll say look here and we're like, ha, ha, ha. But no one is owning that as a decision, right? We need to normalize this type of things, right? We need people to be able to just live healthy and do what's right for them, like what they feel is right.
Great. Thank you.
Can I just address that quickly?
Question here.
Sorry, can I just address that quickly? I just wanted to make it very, very clear. And I think it's, sorry, I didn't make about the assumption you were 15 years old or anything else like that. But I think that the assumption, and I think it's a very, very good question about we've won, or that it's a final destination or so, or anything else like that. I remember I've been through multiple career changes. I used to be a banker, then I went to become a media executive, then I walked away from that too. And the key driver why I was often walking away is because even though I might have been doing extremely well beyond my dreams financially, I was never, ever happy. The alarm clock, I wanted to throw my phone out the window, going into the office completely and utterly depressed and wearing a mask, a literal mask, not a literal mask, but a metaphorical mask or so, to literally just disguise the fact that I just wanted, and it felt like financially I could afford to pay my bills, but it didn't feel like I was winning. And subsequently, I actually felt fantastically more vulnerable and fragile as a result, as opposed to actually just feeling like I'm winning, I'm the man, or something else like that. There were actually times, just as MI points out too, quite literally, I'll be at work or so, and I'm there earning money that most people would consider to be a dream come true. And I would just spend half an hour in the toilet looking at the floor, crying my eyes out, because it just wasn't a matter of how, it didn't feel like winning. It literally felt like losing. And that is the most spoilt brat thing you'll possibly ever hear today. But it's just true. It just doesn't, yeah.
At all. It's real.
Wow. Thank you. I know we're out of time, but just another round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you, MI. Thank you, Nelzabi. Thank you, Namdi Ahirim. And a huge thank you to Chuku Kimera for doing a stellar job. Thank you very much. So you're going to take a quick group photo. MI, we hope you'll come back. You need to come and listen to some more of these conversations. And bring Jesse Jags. And Brimo. Who else?
Many steps to take, but when you're a centipede, many feats you'll accomplish. Letting the spirit lead is me and God's son in the track, the Trinity. Stay sharp.
Wait.
Stay dark while the bigger picture's developing. Cause every ring has the condition that you begin. Exhale and set sail, the brave traveler. One shot, I got Nas, the same caliber. Hit by don't like yo, what up, my nigga? This shit's above us, just like Canada. This is for the kid within listening. People will have talent, have discipline. My vision, it gets bigger with time. If I ever rest shit, I give you mountains to climb.
You know the scene when I did it down. They beg Baba, make a day bigger. When I got bigger, problems got bigger. Money and fame is sweet and bitter. Strings stay attached to rhyme like guitar. But we they run the streets like cheetah. My dreams got bigger and I'm still getting bigger. Yeah. Number one. Everybody ready know I want it number one. Look good up by it, you don't know by wrong. Number one. Everybody ready know I want it number one. Look good up by it, you don't know by wrong. Number one.
There's no draining of the swamp.
Okay, we're diving right into the next event.
Leaving teeth marks in your soul, a la carte.
It's non-stop. When I keep telling people that at Ake, your brain, it's like you have dynamite in the brain. Get up from that seat, somebody else will sit there. So again, I'm going to ask everyone over here to come to the center, come to this aisle. That would be wonderful. Yeah? Come over here. Everyone over there, just come closer. Come over here, please. Thank you. Let's do it really quickly. The way you were looking longingly at them, they're like, why am I not getting a photo with them? Jenny, my love. My sweet sis. Who? Oh, that's nice. Thank you. I know. Look at them. Look at it. They never act this way when it's meal that I come to.
At the beginning of the panel, people are not introducing their panelists, right? It's not a time-saving thing because they already have it there.
All right. So the reason we don't spend a lot of time introducing our guests when they're on panels is because you've got this. Everything that you want to know about them, you can find out from this booklet. We prefer to dive right in and start the conversations. So again, I'm asking everybody over here. Okay, let me just clear this aisle. Everybody go over to that side. Run and move. Oh yeah, fine people. Dotsu. Come on, Rosemary, come over here. Yes. So it's more intimate. Right, introducing the next event. It's a book chat that's going to be hosted by one of our authors at WIDA. We love her, we adore her work. And it is the person of the lovely Bisi Ajapon. Why are you taking Bisi's thunder? Try to steal her thunder. So you see, do you like how I introduce these writers like rock stars? Do you know why I do it? Because they are rock stars. That's right. Yeah, I would take any of these writers over, say, Denzel. Say lie. All right. So, and it's my twin who's coming over here. Many people keep saying, why do you people call yourself twins? It's because if you go into the media, especially in the West, they will write Lola Shone, they put Zuki's picture. Sometimes they will write Zuki's one, they put my picture. So even in South Africa, so we had an agreement that we are just going to be each other. It doesn't matter. If you call me Zuki, I will answer you, right? Oh yeah, go and sit, Lola. Please join me in giving Zukizwa and Ake Festival welcome. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Wow. Now, someone told me you slept for 2 hours yesterday, and I can believe it because of your energetic outbursts and singing, and it is no wonder that you have produced 11 books at the age of what, 16? Oh my God. So this is really
And this is just to say that I'm at the age of consent.
Okay, so we are very glad to have you. And honestly, before I start anything at all, I'm just going to ask you, do you want to read a little something for us from one of your many books? A favorite, the one that won an award being London, Cape Town, Joburg. Have you seen the cover?
Okay, all right. I think maybe I will read from that. Let me see.
Whichever you want to read. Let's go on.
By show of hands, how many people speak Xhosa?
Xhosa?
Yeah. Okay, then I'm going to read that. Meanwhile, because this is homecoming, Martin was having quite a heated discussion with the immigration officer on the other side. I didn't know what was being said. I didn't realize then that I was about to be introduced to a South Africa that is not in the brochures, right there at the airport. A South Africa that Liam had warned me about, but I'd chosen to ignore. That I was about to get a South African introduction in black and white. Later on, when I knew some Xhosa, I heard it went something like this. Immigration officer, Molo Budi, Martin, Ewe, Njani. And then Martin handed over his passport. Immigration officer, how? Omali. Martin, yes, Omali. Immigration office, your passport kabani lena Budi. Martin, it's mine. Immigration officer, no. What's your passport number? Martin, annoyed. What do you mean, what's my passport number? Is there a problem? Hey, I'm the one asking questions here. You want to tell me you are Omali when? As black as you are. I could alternatively just say Niels Abbey. Where are you from? Martin, South Africa. Hey man, I'm tired. I've had a long flight. Immigration officer. So why are you speaking closer with an accent, hey? Where in South Africa are you from? Martin, raising voice. My family is from the Eastern Cape, okay? Immigration officer. You can't tell me you're from Emakaya, Wena. You are too dark to be a closer. At which point, I knocked on the immigration officer's booth from the other side and said in my most posh, everyone in my English neighborhood has a lord lady before their name accent. Officer, is there a problem with my husband's passport? Immigration officer. Hello, madam. Can I help you, madam? Jermaine. I said, is there a problem with my husband's passport? Should I call our barrister? Immigration officer. Is this your husband? Stamps passport. Hi, no, madam. No problem at all. Slides passport back to Martin. A mistake, chief. Welcome home.
Thank you so much, Zukiswa, for that truly dramatic reading. And one can't help wondering and being a little saddened by this kind of thing that seems to happen. Travel within Africa for Africans and the racism that we exhibit towards one another. How has this been some of your experience in your own travels?
I've weirdly faced a lot of generosity in my travels. I remember being here at the height of
the Afrophobic attacks of 2018 or 2018, I think it was. And there was a security officer, one of the customs guys, and he said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Lesotho." And he says to me, nah, you're South African. And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said the most beautiful thing to me. He says, "You know what, my sister? Some of us are bad and some of you are bad. Some of us are good and some of you are good. Your country doesn't represent you. We're all Africans." And it was just so profound and so beautiful,
That is truly wonderful, and it's true. You actually are somebody who has traveled a lot, and one of your books that is a favorite is Hardly Working, where you've traveled. You decided to take your son on a journey through Africa, and you said something to the effect that other people were going to take their children to Europe and to America.
It was actually a school trip to Barcelona, and I was like, dude, you haven't even been to like Tanzania. You want to go to Barcelona for what?
And that is truly remarkable, because wherever you find yourself, you make yourself at home. The first time I met you at Ake, I actually thought you were probably from Ghana, and you were not from Ghana, and you've traveled all over. Tell us about some of the travels that have been most memorable in Africa compared to traveling in the West.
One of them, it had to be like when we go to Malawi, and we're at the border. So we're in Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi border. So we get to the Tanzanian side, and we happen to be traveling with my partner, who is unfortunately a Kenyan, because Tanzanians don't like Kenyans, So he takes out his passport, and then we hadn't got stamped out. We stamped in, and there was some wahala there. Anyway, this guy says to us, "No, we need to pay a certain amount of money, and there isn't a visa fee." So we're just like, I said, "Guys, let's just..." Okay, firstly, I started crying. I don't know where the tears came from. I just started crying. I was like, Jomba, and I just started crying. And this guy is looking at me like, "Please get away with those dramatics." It didn't work. I couldn't believe a man wouldn't. Anyway, besides that, we decided that we're going to walk to the border, right? So we walk. We're just like, "I'm not going to listen to this guy. Guys, let's go." So we walked. We get to the other side. We get to Malawi. And this border, it's like by a village, So there's a boom gate, and it just gets raised when it's a truck that's going. But otherwise, people are just going. It's a porous border. People are just going. People don't even know that this is Tanzania, this is Malawi. People are just walking. So when we get there, it's a tent. These guys look at us. They said, "What do you want?" We said, "We're here to get our passports stamped." And they're like, "Oh, okay." And they take out this counter book, and then they're like, "Can you put your name, surname, profession, reason for visit?" It was kind of like, when you go into those posh estates, and I always write ministers' names. So we put, and this guy looks and he says, "Author?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you have any books on you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Can I see?" And I showed him. And then he says, "Can I buy?" It was just so absolutely amazing. And I said, "Yeah, sure." So he says, "How much?" And I just told him a very small fee, because I know how much we pay our civil servants all over this continent. Anyway, and then the policeman came, and he also wanted to buy. And then they started sharing their sugar cane with us, And I was just trying to figure out, like, Oliver Tambo International Airport. You are entering from another African country. You're not South African, even if you're South African. Hey, is anybody going to share a sugar cane with you? You see. So that was one of the most beautiful ones. And the Zambia-Zimbabwean border as well, because they have one border. So it's one room. So you just go and you go around So it's really lovely and convenient, I think Malawi, Zambia is also the same. So it's just one room, and you go get your passport stamped, and then you get your passport stamped on the Zimbabwean side, and you're out.
Wow. If you want to know about Zukiswa's travels, and she has traveled extensively, I'm looking at the time, and we are supposed, it's not just a book chat. We have to get through as many of her books as possible. So if you want to know all about her travels, and I tell you, there are instances where people are talking to her husband, asking for a copy of her book instead of talking to her directly, all sorts of experiences in the West too. So go ahead and pick up a copy from Reader Books, and that is hardly working. And I want to move on to Men of the South because of the conversation that happened earlier. You actually wrote a book from the perspective of three men in the first person, and this is challenging the masculinity of what we are used to thinking as a masculinity of African men. So can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, okay, so the story really behind that is I'm always trying to challenge myself as a writer, and after I'd written The Madams and Behind Every Successful Man, somebody, despite the fact that majority of book buyers are actually women, somebody said that I was the first South African author of black chick lit, you know, which is like a nonsense statement because you never hear anybody talking about penis lit, do you? You know? So I was just like, okay, I want to write a book with three male characters, and let's see how it works. So that's what I did, but I also wanted to show the vulnerabilities, but also because I'm a partner, I've got male friends, I'm a cousin to guys, and I wanted to explore the idea of what are the issues that guys might be having, you know. Modern world is challenging, so we have challenges as women, but guys, I think, also have challenges. And I wanted to explore that and question that. And I realized that perhaps I'd managed to do too good of a job of it when there's a man who called me, and he said, may I talk to Zukiswa? And I said, yes, this is Zukiswa. And he said, you're a woman? And I said, yes. And this man had... you know, his wife always said that she was going to hang out with me. And then he read Men of the South, and he thought I was a man. So now the dynamics had changed about him hanging out with Zukiswa, you see. Fortunately for my friend, she's no longer with him.
Was he going to tell you to stay away from his wife?
Like, what is that?
Oh my goodness. What was very interesting was that the main character, Mfundu, was talking about some of the issues that the men brought up, that there was no template. The father was no longer there. And his big brother was gone, and he now had to be the man taking care of his family, and
exactly.
He didn't know what he was supposed to do.
Exactly, and there's so much pressure on kids. I've heard people say to my son, take care of your mother, and I'm like, no, he doesn't need to take care of me. He's my son. He's a child. I'm taking care of him. You don't tell him to take care of his mother. Be the man of the house. No, you're not the man of the house. And even if you've broken your voice, I'm still going to slap you, even if I have to stay on a chair, you know? But yeah, so the idea of men have to do certain things and whatever, I think I wanted to explore that, and I enjoyed doing that. And I'm not able to disclose yet, but it's actually in production. Beyond that, it's in production as film. So
I am so excited.
Hopefully.
No. This is exciting because you do that brilliantly. And another thing that was truly fascinating was discovering that, not discovering, we know that, but again about sexuality, what an African man is supposed to be like in bed or with whom in bed, and that kind of thing, and the shocking revelations. And this whole idea, because this is also about homecoming, how to find a home, and talk about his best friend and the issues surrounding his sexuality.
Essentially, it's a gay guy, but because he's got like this very macho name, and he's got this family that is all about tradition and wherever, he actually ends up getting married to a woman but he pulls what in South Africa are called after nines, which is essentially in the evening he goes and he hooks up with guys, but but the wife is like, oh, I'm going out with the boys, and he's really going out with the boys, and then later on, like, they kind of like find out, and then now he has to move cities because he doesn't want his father to know. He doesn't want what you call it. So he moves cities, and he meets somebody and is able then to be fully himself and just be in his space. And so sometimes, in order to gain a certain level of comfort, we might actually just need to, to just say, all right, I'm leaving this particular place because of its toxicity, because of the way it is, and I'm going to move to another place.
Oh, I just wish we could dive more into the book because there are so many issues. There's a third man because there are three men, and you write from all these different points of view, and each character is so distinct. It's such a great piece of work. I wish everybody could get a copy. So please try and get a copy, and if Wida Books doesn't have a copy, I'm sure they will be only too glad to order one for you. And
BC Ajafon, my hype man, everybody.
and honestly, that is a book that is truly fascinating. And again, this concept of home, where this third character has moved from, was it Zimbabwe?
Yeah.
And is trying to create a home for himself. But the interesting thing is how all three of them find themselves kind of in love with one woman who happens to be somebody else's wife. And I'm not going to give all the, no spoilers, but you have to read the book for yourself. And now, I'm sorry, but I have to move on to another book,
Absolutely.
which, by the way, everybody can see that Zukiswa is very rebellious. So Zukiswa decided to write a book called The Madams. And this involves three women, one of them who is a white, snobbish person. But there is always a catch with Zukiswa. Nothing is as it seems. So these three friends are great friends, and then Candy, the first character, decides to acquire a maid too, and decides to acquire a white maid.
Yes.
And so this is bound to cause conflict. But it turns out that there is so much more to the stories and what it reveals. Can you tell us about The Madams?
I think, I wrote The Madams first, so that was my first novel, and I actually think that Men of the South was a reply to The Madams, because I thought I also want, so it was really three women and really talking about what does being a woman mean in contemporary society, and how we constantly have to change our perspective and the way we do things. I know all of us, I know certainly you, certainly me, we've had to unlearn a lot of things that we grew up with about what it means to be a woman, Like, I remember my mom would come like at 5:30 in the morning, on a weekend, 6 in the morning, then just opening the curtains, and like, hey, you are still sleeping, This is why you won't get married. And it was like honestly, like, being married is like the greatest thing for any woman and stuff. Or you don't know how to cook. This is not like you don't know how to cook. This is, you need to learn how to cook so that you can feed yourself. No, you don't know how to cook. Who's gonna marry you if you don't know how to cook? So there were like this crazy little narratives the whole time. And so there were things that we had to unlearn. And when I was dealing with The Madams, I was also like, okay, what are the complications, So when you have Tandi, for instance, then you have Mandla, who's like her partner, and he helps, they have this almost egalitarian relationship. When he gets home first, he does the cooking and stuff and everything. But when relatives come, he just sits, He just sits because he's a man, and he doesn't want his mother to say, hey, you've been bewitched, type of thing, right? And so he sits, and then she realizes that this is stressful for her, so she decides that she needs to get a domestic worker. But because of the way race and racism works in South Africa, it wasn't the idea that the idea that she got a white woman as a domestic worker, despite the fact that the white woman needed the job, by the way, the idea that she got didn't sit well with a white friend, you know, because it's like, what are you doing? Why do you have a, what? You know, type of thing, right? So it's kind of like, you know, so it was kind of jarring. It's kind of like when you get somebody asking you for money at the traffic lights, and they're a white person in South Africa, and it's the only time that they'll call you sir or ma'am, you know. so that was the same thing with Thandi and the domestic worker.
What was really fascinating was the compassion that you as an author have for domestic workers. I know that in your own personal life, you have been very helpful during the pandemic. I remember you sharing a story about helping women who were looking for work and raising money to feed people who couldn't afford to feed themselves and who couldn't get jobs. And you did that wonderfully. And so it is evident also in your characterization of Thandi, how Thandi is very sympathetic to maids and makes sure that they are treated well. She talks to her friends and all that. But what is even fascinating is the fact that the three women maintain this really, really wonderful friendship. Tell us about how three women from three distinct backgrounds and go through the most horrendous
stuff and still stick together.
Yes.
I think sometimes I look at like a lot of my friendships. They are friendships that just last against all odds, and then there are people that you lose along the way as you grow older. And the friendships that are worth keeping, you know, they generally stay. Like. And these are people that you can call when you're vulnerable. And when I go to Zim, for instance, I go and stay with I can go and stay with one of my best friend from primary school. You know, we're still friends, or stay with like my high school mates. I actually rarely stay with my relatives unless I'm just visiting them. I generally stay with my friends, and because that's what friendship is. And these are very different people in different ways, but they also understand each other, you know, the friendships in the madams. These three women also understand each other in a very basic way, but they respect each other as well. They love, they laugh, they hurt, you know, and they understand each other's vulnerabilities. And being a friend is about the ability to be vulnerable to those near you, and knowing that you can be safe with them. And so they're able to do that.
That is really a truly wonderful piece of work, and I hope you all get a copy, The Madams, that's the title. And what you said actually made me think about this book that you were reading, and it's also another of your wonderful books, Behind Every Successful Man. Now, that is extremely intriguing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Is a surprised woman. Now, you know, there's this, it's a character who has a certain level of toxicity, so he's successful, but when he starts his job, he just meets this woman, and she finishes her school and stuff, but he says he doesn't want a woman who will work, you know, because the focus must be on the family. The woman must focus on the family. But, you know, when she's like, when she reaches a milestone birthday, she overhears, you know, he's talking to somebody at this birthday party that he's thrown for her, but that is really thrown for himself. He's just showing off. And you know, somebody asks, you know, oh, so Nobantu, what do you do? They ask the wife. And this guy just jumps in and says, this one, she does nothing. She's just a housewife. And of course, we know that even if a woman is just, she doesn't have whatever, there's a lot of work, housework, that's done by being a wife and a mother and whatever. So she then decides that maybe that's not how she wants to be remembered, you know? And so one day she just gets up and gets in a car and leaves. And she says, I have this dream of doing this. I'm going to go and do it. But now, Mandem is left at home. And now he has to be a parent, you know? And he is, it's not working very well for him, you know?
Did you want to read the
Yes,
piece from it?
actually-
Because
actually,
you brought the
you know,
book with you, so I know you want to read from it.
I think I'll actually...
Do you enjoy hearing from Zukiswa? Would you like her to read? Yeah, go ahead.
When he got to the pharmacy, he was perplexed by the amount of choices he was faced with in the sanitary towel section. He picked the first pack of pads that he thought would do and rushed to the checkout counter. The woman at the counter took one look at him and said, "Congratulations, sir. Umfana intombazana." He hated people who wanted to make small talk. Why could she not just scan it and tell him how much it cost? "Ubani umfana intombazana?" he asked, trying his utmost to be patient. "Your child, Baba. I see you picked hospital pads for women who have just given birth." She answered, smirking, probably knowing only too well that they weren't what he wanted. "Oh, damn. I'm sorry. My daughter has just, could you be so kind as to tell me the right sanitary towels to get?" he whispered. "Oh, you mean your daughter has just had her first period?" she asked. It seemed to Andile that she had said that last word so loudly that the whole shop must have heard her. He wondered why women like to say that word out loud like that. It sounded really dirty. Kanye even used it on him when she wanted to take an afternoon off to go shopping. "Mr. Makana, sir," she'd say, "I have period pain. May I please have the afternoon off?" Worked every time.
Oh my goodness, we could listen to you read and read and read forever. But I have a couple more questions for you. So, every book that you have written, and you have written many, the novels are also really, really important. But tell us, and I know this is like asking you to choose, but how many of your babies, which of all the babies you have written or delivered, which one is your favorite?
Come on.
I knew I had to get in one annoying question.
No, I love them all. They're just like their fathers. I like them all in different ways. You know.
I'm really glad that you say that, because all the books that I have read, I have to say that each one gives us a little something to work with, and each one is such a provocative novel. And I went through some of the reviews. What do you say to people who say things like, why do you don't really know men? How could you portray men in that way? What do you say to them?
I think it's kind of like saying, you know, I don't think that makes sense, you know, like, so, because the reason why that doesn't make sense is because we have been like with men all the time. We have lived with men. We've got men, our brothers, they're our fathers. They are in our families. We observe them, and yeah. So I think when somebody says you don't really know men, why are you writing men? It's probably what they're actually saying is maybe you didn't write men well enough. It's kind of like the argument of cultural appropriation, you know, in literature. And when somebody says, oh, there was cultural, it's usually because there has been a failure to write that particular culture well enough that it offends the person who is from that culture. But if you do it well enough, you can always say, you know, you'll see it immediately. One of my very favorite books is Abubakar Adam Ibrahim's Season of Crimson Blossoms. And he writes it from the perspective of this older woman. And he writes it so well and with such sensitivity that I would never say, oh, Abubakar, you know, you can't, I would never deny him that, because I want to write women the way Abubakar writes women, you know?
Yep.
So I think it's just how well the art is, you know? The execution of it is what's most important. So I will write anything I damn well please. I'll write a white woman from Norway, you know? If I so dim fate, you know?
Go ahead, Zukiswa. Just keep writing. You can write from that you have put together and with a young adult team, and that was, tell us what made you bring all those stories together.
Okay, so, well, stories actually for younger kids, that was put with young people probably like age of 9, 10, 11. Because Lola has published it, Wida Books has published it for West Africa, so I know there's some copies here. And I published it for East and Southern Africa, but it's a collection of, it's an anthology of 12 short stories, 12 children's stories, and from 12 writers from 8 African countries. 2 of them are bonus, but I know there are quite a few Nigerians in that anthology. And, but the young adults now, that's different. We did it was called Afro Young Adult, and we did a call out because I realized my son, you know, that sometimes we do things selfishly. My son is 17 now, and I realized that while I could find children's books and I could find a lot of work for adult novels, there seemed to be this gap that was missing for young adult fiction. And so when the Goethe Institute Sub-Saharan Africa said to me, what literary project would I like to do? I was like, how much money do you have? You know? So we did, so what I did is I did a call out and we wanted stories in English, French, and Kiswahili. And we had 435 submissions from across the continent, and then we went through them. We selected about in the language that they were writing in. So we had workshops here in Lagos, we had in Accra, we had in Lome, we had in Dakar, we had in Joburg, we had in Dar es Salaam for Kiswahili, in Kigali, and in Nairobi. And then after that, we sifted through the stories again, and I thought we'd have like 10 or 12 good stories. We ended up having 17 in the anthology, which was published in English and in French. So we had 3 anthologies in English and in French and in Kiswahili. And what happened is we had a panel of adults, but I also had a panel of young adults from across the continent. And if the adults liked the story but the kids didn't like it, I didn't put it in the anthology because they were the audience. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with that. That came out, we actually launched it at the last physical Ake in 2019. Yeah, and we had all the 17 writers who have remained a lot very close to me because every time I check up on them and they're doing amazing projects. People like Howard now is doing his master's in the US, and I think at least 3 of them are doing their masters now in the US.
Wow.
So yeah, masters in creative writing, so that's very exciting.
Wow, what an achievement. I could go on talking. We could discuss this forever, you know, looking at your body of works, and we would never finish, but unfortunately I'm looking at the time and I know it's time for Q&A. So are there any questions for Zukiswa? If you have any questions, please let us know. Yes, Uchenna?
Just so I repeat it while on stage, I already said, you're looking very spiffy, Uchenna.
Isn't he? I tell you.
Thank you so much. I think it's the one question I've always wanted to ask you is where do you get all of the energy? Really. I'm just 23, and then
2 hours
I do
sleep.
very little, and I get tired. And then I look at your body of work, I'm like, okay, you have no excuse. I want to know, where do you get all of the energy? I know you're currently running a residency, and you're here. And then I'm wondering, how do you do all of this? How?
it helps to have parallel lives. No. You know, I just really think that I am at that stage in my life where I want to leave something. I want to leave something beyond just cadaver. So, and the things that I want to do. I haven't even started doing half of them. So, but yeah, but I think it's important. And I mean, you know, with people like Lola, what she's doing. Actually, you should be asking where Lola gets all the energy, because she does even more than I do. But maybe that's why we're twins. Because I look at her and I'm like, no, now I must do more, you know. But I think that's really, it's just, and I have a very supportive, nobody ever talks about this, but we have the most supportive community of writers on this continent, you know. So I am very lucky in that way, because I'll ask writers for favors and they'll do it, which is very adorable. So I think the community makes it happen. And because it's also very important for us I realize that dreams that I have, like where I want to see our literary space being, and I realize that if I wait for somebody else to do it, it might not happen. So I'm like, why not, you know?
Thank you, Lola. And somebody else? Yes. Kina. Oh, you see, I just called her Lola. You did that. All this twinship, you did that. Go ahead.
Hi. It's a rejoinder to what she's saying. You know, what she should say is that Zuki is exceptionally singular in her focus to writing. She's going to be one of those African writers, and we don't have a lot, who will have an incredible amount of output.
Yep.
So she can tell you, oh, I'm doing this and I'm doing what was it you were doing with Goethe Institute? Yeah. Whatever that was.
Virtually yours, etc.
But what she never walks away from is her writing. There are two in the room, in fact three, Jennifer, Aisha, and Zukiswa. But Zukiswa might have you beat. She's going to publish an extraordinary amount of books, and that is because she's very clear. Her job is a writer.
Very prolific. We'll have a Zukiswa live.
Oh, look at you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Anybody else with a question? We have time for a couple more. Oh, yes, you do, yeah. Go ahead, Nana Dakwa.
Nana Dakwa, Sex Lives of African Women, everybody.
I guess I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to, do you ever struggle to write? And what do you do if you struggle? And I'm also interested in how you take care of yourself, just like body, soul, and spirit.
Okay. Very good question.
I generally don't struggle to write, and the reason I don't struggle to write is I don't say I'm gonna write like 1,000 words a day. I only write when I actually feel like I have something to say. So I might go for like 4 or 5 months without even writing so much as an essay, because I don't feel like I have anything to say at that point in time. And then I will have an idea for a book, and it will just maybe be swirling in my head, and then next thing it will be like over 3 weeks, and then 40,000 words or whatever, 50,000, 60, you know, type of thing. So, yeah, and how do I take care of myself? Okay, I really, like, I discovered running during the pandemic, so there's that. There's also sex.
And as I recall, you during the Afro-Lit section, you said you do a lot of it.
And just really like, I also really don't like sweating the small stuff. So when I'm around people with bad energy, I just like, I distance myself from them. So I have a lot of people with good energy around me, and that's how I take care of myself.
So the takeaway is to be kind to yourself, to
Sex.
be gentle, and also to take care of your mind and your body and your soul and all that. That is truly wonderful. We have time for more questions. Anybody else with questions? Yes? Please, a mic here, please.
Hi, my name is Efwa. Is there a mic around?
Yes.
Okay. So my main question is to you, because we've talked a bit about.
Can you hear her? Oh, can we have a mic for her, please? Oh, you can take mine. Go ahead, take mine.
All right, thank you.
Oh, well, they beat me to it.
So we've talked a bit about your journey as a writer, and I mean, it was fantastic. Like, I was looking you up while you were speaking, just like seeing all the different things that you do. But I guess my question is, when it comes to reading, when it comes to the practice of observation, because I did when I was looking at the kinds of books that you wrote and when you were speaking, I felt like a lot of them were also around, like, you must be very good at observation, right? And understanding these stories and being able to tell them from a very empathetic point of view. So my question is really, how much time do you spend reading and observing? Because I think, and side projection, but I think as writers, one of our jobs really is to read a lot more. So yeah, that really is my main question.
Okay, all right. So on average, I generally read about 2 books a week. And I read widely, and the bad books have taught me how not to write, and the good books teach me what to, aspire to. So I do that, but also I sometimes, I sometimes just go on public transport and just listen to conversations. There is nothing like as just overhearing people's conversations is amazing for dialogue, and also just watching people. I'm an only child, so I grew up watching people and listening to people, and also like just being the kid. I grew up being the kid who was amongst adults, and so when a kid is around, after a while, people forget that there's a kid around, and then they start saying things. So I remember some of those conversations as well. So just that, and of course, listening to people and talking to people, and I'm a very social being, and so for that reason, I'm able to then see certain things about people, even sometimes when I'm just watching. Ole, what did you do?
Yeah, but very quickly, what you said was very important. You are somebody who is not originally from Kenya. You're married to a Kenyan. You are also South African, and you are also, is it Zambian?
Yeah, I'm also
and all that.
Zimbabwean.
And it looks as if you are able to make yourself
I'm also
at
Nigerian.
home. You are and Ghanaian. So home for you, tell us what home for you is. That's the last question.
This whole continent really is home for me. I have been very lucky that it has also been extremely generous to me. So I'm that person who can go. Guys, I even now know somebody from Central African Republic. Hey! So I can even go to Central African Republic and I'll have a place to sleep, But yeah, so I think just this whole continent, this is home to me.
Okay, so our time is up. Thank you so much. Everybody give Zukiso Havana a big round of applause. We love
Thank you, everyone. You have been an amazing audience and very generous with the applause. And thank you, Lola, and congratulations on the 10th year.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. A round of applause for our amazing speakers. We're just going to take quick photos. We're going to go straight into the next session after photos with the writers. We have refreshments downstairs at the marketplace for anyone who would like a bite to eat or something to drink.
small corner to show that you're caring for the environment. It could be that we invite the beautiful Joan to come and just talk to us for 10 minutes about what she does. So we're just going to spread it. And what that will allow us to do is also to catch up, because we're behind. So we're going to start the next session in about 8 minutes. So that's just so you know that's what's going on. Stretch your legs, walk around, have tea, coffee, whatever, and be happy. Thank you so much.
As me I wake up, now she did my mind don't walk. Then one day two, one of you focus. Now so me I go down, see me willing go up. As I start to the life, you know my heart it is. Baby girl, if you leave me, I don't go love again. Because you get many girls we put my heart for bed. Baby, you feel my pain. Baby, calm down. Yo, this your body, it puts in my heart for lockdown, oh lockdown. Yo, you sweet life, phantom. If I tell you say I love you, you know they for me young girl. No, tell me no, baby, come give me your lo. You got me like Shawty, come give me your lo.
Wait! Did you download Grammarly? Come on, man. Everyone's using it. If you want to ace this paper, then don't press submit. Grammarly helps you clean up your messy, confusing sentences to get your point across clearly. See how much more clear and confident you sound now? Thank you, future Brent. No problem, Brent.